Hello, today on my channel you will hear an amazing story about life. I hope you enjoy this story. This one struck me to the core. Honestly, I still can't forget it. Enjoy watching.
The morning was coming on fast, as it happens only in summer when the sun begins to please the earth very early. Julia, as always, got up before her husband Dustin. She had long been accustomed to mornings, beginning with the quiet bustle of the kitchen, the smell of freshly brewed coffee, and the peaceful rustle of the newspapers her husband usually read at breakfast. "Good morning, Julia. I expect everything from you. But who needs it? I wish you were still in bed," said Dustin, entering the kitchen. She had just put a pan of pancakes on the stove. "Morning," Julia said, turning to him and adding, "I'm making pancakes for breakfast." Dustin shook his head, grimaced, and sat down sipping at the table with the newspaper open. As Julia deftly flipped the pancakes, she realized that this morning was not going to be as peaceful as it seemed. "Listen, Julia, you probably already know what needs to be done today, don't you?" husband asked, putting the newspaper aside and looking at her with interest. Julia sighed sadly. To be honest, his daily tasks were getting tiresome. One thing at a time. She wasn't his maid. She was not his maid, and she had a job to do. "I don't know," Julia replied sincerely, adding a dollop of cherry jam to the saucer. He grinned. "Well, since you don't know, I'll tell you. You need to go to the cemetery to see my mother. It was in the will, wasn't it? She wanted you to be the one to take care of her grave." Julia shuddered. Laura had hated her from the first day she'd met her, and in 5 years of married life she'd managed to make Julia recognize her unpleasant side. "Why me, Dustin? You know we've always been at odds." "I offered to leave her," Julia asked sadly. Dustin's eyebrows rose indignantly. "What's wrong with that? It was her last will and testament, so please accept it and show respect for the deceased." He raised his voice. Julia realized at once that a scandal could not be avoided. Dustin hadn't been himself lately, nervous, angry, as if Julia were to blame for his problems at work. It was a shame, she thought. She worked as a nurse in therapy, serving the homeless. No, Julia wasn't complaining. It was just that sometimes her husband's nagging became unbearable. The coffee was not strong and hot enough, her favorite cufflinks were lost somewhere, and her tie looked as if it had been chewed by a camel. It was all Rose's fault. But what else could it be? There's no one else. Dustin, not knowing how to continue the unpleasant conversation, reached for his cup. Julia, flipping the pancakes diligently, was already mentally imagining how she would spend her time in the city cemetery today. And this heat. It was already 35 in the morning. What's it going to be by noon? 40. Well, are you coming or not? You realize there's a reason for all this. Your mother named you in her will, so she wanted you to look after her. Well, so to speak, in the next world. And if I don't, I can't inherit. You know that. I need the money now," Dustin persisted. Julia removed another pancake with a spatula and turned her head to her husband and asked, "Do you know that I didn't like her very much when she was alive either? About the dead do not speak badly, but the grief with her I had a lot. So what of it? You think that matters to me now? My mother's gone. And I can't inherit because you're too lazy to go to the cemetery," Dustin said wryly. Julia's cheeks flushed. "I don't mind. It's just that I'm there every week. But why would I do that? You're the son, after all. I know you two have had a complicated relationship, but that still doesn't absolve you of your obligations," the husband replied, careful lest coffee in the spoon. "Complicated?" Julia asked with pain in her voice. "That's an understatement. She disliked me from day one. She put me in her will as if she'd put me in a cage. I couldn't do anything without her permission. I couldn't even go to the store without her approval of my clothing choices. Oh, come on, it's your little business. You say you have to do it, you have to do it. It's a no-brainer. After all, it's not that hard. I'm in the office 24 hours a day, and I'm trying to keep my business afloat. What about you? Come in, wipe the floors, take out a couple of bottles and sit back and do crossword puzzles, Dustin objected. Tears glistened in Julia's eyes. How dare he say that, Julia thought. She remembered well how her mother-in-law had wanted to make her to her own standards, to make Julia like her. Greedy, bossy, cynical, the kind of business shark who had inherited from her husband, who had been killed in a crime spree. In the end, Julia agreed, she had always been inferior to her husband in everything. Dustin was a master of suppressing the will of others, doing it every chance he got. Thus the breakfast, which began with an uncomfortable conversation, turned into one big insult for Julia. Her mother-in-law would not give her peace even in the other world, as if in mockery, having forced her daughter-in-law to visit her in the cemetery by means of a will. Dustin was triumphant. He felt victorious. The wretched nurse had gotten herself in trouble. He'd teach her a lesson. Julia decided not to waste any time, so she started packing right after breakfast. After all, she'd have to take the bus. Dustin was busy again, important negotiations, the deal of the century. Though he always says so, and then complains about the losses, or missed an important clause in the contract. The late Laura never let that happen. When concluding a contract, she always put on glasses and scrutinized every aspect of the upcoming deal. She didn't trust anyone, kept her managers under strict control, made them watch each other, collected dirt on everyone. A kind of gray cardinal in a skirt. Julia shook her head sadly. She left the house and went to the nearest flower shop to buy flowers. She didn't buy artificial flowers. A lib bouquet was preferable. The sun baked mercilessly. Even the asphalt seemed to breathe heat. Julia, roses clutched in her hand, walked along the hot path leading to the cemetery gates. She didn't like coming here. She'd always been uncomfortable among the gray tombstones and mounds of graves, which smelled of longing and hopelessness. But today she had to come. It was the anniversary of Laura's passing. The bus dropped her off at a stop about 300 meters from the cemetery. It was hot in the cabin, too. Summer was coming into its own. The temperature had risen to prohibitive heights. It was hard. It seemed like a short walk to the cemetery, but try to walk that distance under the scorching sun. Julia stopped to catch her breath. Leaning against the tree, she felt its rough bark on her shoulders. And why? She'd only listened to Dustin and dragged herself to the cemetery today. She'd gone along with his whims again. And she said no more than once. And she's still showing weakness. Suddenly, Julia felt sick. She felt dizzy. Her eyes went black. She tried to lean on a tree trunk, but her legs gave out. Julia slowly settled to the ground, feeling the heat coursing through her body. That's it. Here we go. Her mind raced through her head. Everything was double in her eyes. She was very thirsty. There was no more strength to get up. Everything happened so fast that Julia didn't have time to realize anything. She fell, and that was it. Unable to get up, she closed her eyes doomily when she heard someone's quiet voice. "Girl, are you ill?" It had cost her a great deal of labor to open her eyelids, and at the same moment she saw in front of her a young, slender guy, blonde-haired with blue eyes, who looked at her with genuine concern. "What's the matter? You seem to have fainted in the middle of nowhere." The stranger, dressed in the characteristic uniform of a cemetery worker, said cautiously. "The sun, it's the sun," Julia whispered, trying to pull herself out of the sticky oblivion. The young gravedigger didn't think for long and quickly picked Julia up in his arms and carried her toward the gatehouse. The boy had already guessed that she had probably gotten sunstroke from walking toward the cemetery in the sunny weather. The elderly caretaker had oriented himself in time and immediately rushed to help. What the hell happened? She looks young. No wonder it's so hot today. I can barely keep from fainting, the gravedigger smiled, and then gently carried Julia into the room. To her surprise, it was quite cool, thanks to the fact that there was a fan running. The curtains had been pulled back, which made the room feel pleasantly dim. She felt better at once. It was no longer the blazing sun, which was clearly going to burn everything alive today. Thank you so much. I don't know what I would have done if it hadn't been for you, Julia whispered with a smile. Fred lowered his eyes in embarrassment. Frankly speaking, he didn't see any merit in helping a girl in trouble. Oh, really? You're welcome. Anyone would do that in my place, he said. I don't know. I know you, boy. You're easygoing. You always help and come to the rescue with a smile, said the caretaker. But the older man's eyes showed that he respected his colleague from the cemetery and treated him like a son. Fred was even more embarrassed, and then looked at the caretaker with a smile. Come on, Stephen. What's the big deal? Just doing my job the way I'm supposed to. Everything else is just petty stuff. Watching their conversation, Julia caught herself the thought that she was imbued with undisguised respect and sympathy for both of them, because there was something in their conversation which unwillingly set up a favorable mood. Soon Stephen helped her to wash her face and bring her to her senses. Here, have some water from the well. My teeth are chapped. Fred ran down to the village himself and got some. So drink it. It tastes wonderful, the caretaker said with a smile. Julia took a careful sip, and indeed the water was very good. Perhaps it was the thirst that had been plaguing her ever since she had fainted. Looking around, she realized that the bouquet she had bought had been lost. Intercepting her gaze, Fred immediately added, I left the flowers outside. We have a container of water there so they won't wilt. When you come to your senses, can you take them to the right place? Julia nodded. At that moment her eyes shone with gratitude to this nice guy. It was as if a good wizard appeared out of nowhere and saved her in a difficult moment. And really it should have been Dustin. After all, it was his mother who Julia had just come to see. What's there to say? It's all so clear. Julia cringed at the memory of her husband. Dustin could have gone with her and made time for her on such an important day. Instead, he'd gone to the negotiations as if nothing had happened, leaving his wife to fend for herself. Would think she had the day off today. Otherwise, he would have had to ask for time off from the manager, who was extremely stingy with such generosity. Not many tomatoes, Grandpa Stephen asked. Who are you going to see, honey? Who do you have here? Pardon me for asking. I'm not really a nosy man, but because of my job, I had to ask. Julia laughed a little and then came clean. Then I came here to see my mother-in-law, Laura. She left a while ago. I've been visiting her ever since. Stephen looked at her with undisguised respect. That's the right thing to do. And then everyone does what they do. Say, my mother-in-law is not my own. Let my husband take care of her. And you do humanely. For a long time I have not met people like you. Julia smiled. At the same time, Fred was watching her every movement, every gesture. The young gravedigger's eyes were filled with joy that he had managed to save such a good girl. When Julia finally came to her senses, Stephen gave her tea, not plain tea, but green tea cooled to a pleasant temperature, which was kept in an old thermos. Now, don't be afraid, I pick my own herbs. So this tea contains all the most valuable from Mother Nature. I used to live in the village, and with my grandmother often went to the forest for herbs. So I can always tell the difference between St. John's wort and mother and stepmother. Julia talked with the caretaker and the gravedigger a little longer, and then went to the grave. Later at the door, Fred asked, "Look, do you mind if I walk you out? I don't know if I'm going to be sick again. I'll avoid the burial grounds. I won't go with you, of course. It's just that I'll be calmer that way." Julia smiled and accepted the offer. Deep down, she liked this young man, who behaved with her like a real gentleman. After all, it had been a long time she herself had seen any real manly behavior, especially considering Dustin's behavior, who at first had been quite different, attentive, kind, caring. Now he was interested in nothing but money and his own gain. But it was foolish to expect anything different from Dustin, given that Laura had been raising him. The woman was not a bad woman, and in business she behaved competently and unceremoniously. Gradually, Julia began to feel better. She walked in silence. Left alone with Fred, she felt constrained. This was despite the fact that the young gravedigger did everything he could to make her feel comfortable. To some extent, Fred had succeeded in doing so. So he switched to you rather quickly in conversation, which definitely made for a more cordial conversation. Soon a familiar grave mound with a massive wooden cross, custom made by a funeral service, appeared ahead. As Julia approached the grave, she lowered her head mournfully. Fred had stopped a few meters before the graves, so as not to disturb Julia from doing what she had come here to do. Fred had been working at the cemetery for a little over 3 months, and in that time he had seen a lot. Unlike the other employees, he had no tolerance for alcohol, and never participated in the drinking that somehow appeared in the cemetery during the wake of the deceased. Almost no one knew that Stephen had personally contributed to Fred being hired. Watching Julia tidy up the grave mound, Fred suddenly remembered an incident from a week ago. He had been painting the fence at one of the graves at the request of a relative living abroad. This had been a common practice for a long time, as not everyone was able to take care of the graves of relatives who were far away. That's when Fred saw an older woman whose face was partially hidden by a black-colored shawl tied around her head. There seemed to be nothing special in the fact that a relative of the deceased had come to the grave. As she passed Fred, the stranger looked at him with a look of contempt that made him uneasy. "Why is she staring at me like that, as if I had done something bad to her?" thought Fred to himself, and went on with his work. Meanwhile, the stranger in the shawl approached Laura's grave and lowered her head mournfully. Then she approached the cross, and wiping the photograph with her handkerchief, touched her lips to it for a fraction of a second. Fred wrinkled his nose slightly. No, of course he had seen this sort of thing many times before and thought it was normal. Still, something about this woman's behavior seemed strange to him. It didn't fit with the look of someone who was grieving for a departed relative. In his heart, Fred himself could not explain what he felt at that moment. Most likely it all happened at the level of subconsciousness, or came from the heart. Few people knew that Fred's grandmother was a hereditary fortune teller and predicted the fate with amazing accuracy. Unfortunately, this gift was passed only through the female line. And that was the end of Fred. The guy himself was not very sad about it, because all this magical paraphernalia did not cause him anything but a condescending smile. Only the late grandmother Emily endowed him with a certain gift, which manifested itself only in exceptional cases. For example, once, while still in school, little Fred felt that it was not worth it to go with his friends to skate on the ice of the frozen river. There were severe frosts. His friends laughed at him, and Fred felt that Erica was in danger. "Fred, don't be such a baby, let's go. Are we going to play hockey or just go for a ride? My father went fishing yesterday. He said the ice is 30 to 40 centimeters, said Fred, his best friend Vincent. The 10-year-old Fred just shook his head and referred to tiredness and problems with his lessons. In fact, he felt there was no way he could go to the fort today. Even many years later, When Fred recalled that mysterious incident, he could not explain to himself what kept him from taking such a rash step. Many call it an inner voice, some call it intuition. But here Fred literally heard in his head the voice of his late grandmother, who asked him not to go to the river that day. Fred stayed home, despite the sarcastic taunts of his friends. An hour later, the boy learned that his friend Vincent fell into the ice hole and almost drowned, getting frostbite on his hands and feet. Fortunately, the boy was saved. About 2 months he was in the hospital with severe pneumonia. Fred forever remembered that incident, and since then always listened to his inner voice. And so it was this time, when he felt that the stranger who came to Laura's grave was clearly not who she said she was. For some inexplicable reason, he had an association in his mind, a wolf in sheep's clothing. The vision was so vivid and detailed that the young gravedigger became dizzy. Fred later explained that he had probably inhaled paint fumes and had some sort of hallucination. It happened sometimes, especially when working in hot weather in the open sun. Should I tell Julia about it? Or shouldn't I? He asked himself. Although Fred had not seen the mysterious woman in the black shawl again since then, he suddenly felt a keen desire to share what he had seen. Memories of the strange stranger kept coming back to his mind. Perhaps it was all a figment of his imagination. How many people come to the cemetery to visit their deceased relatives? There's no telling. But for some reason he remembered her, looking at him with such contempt, as if Fred owed her something. Standing at Laura's grave, Julia felt ambivalent feelings. On the one hand, she was sorry that her mother-in-law had passed away so soon. And on the other hand, the young nurse still did not understand why Laura had refused her services as a nurse when she was alone with a formidable illness. Not only that, but she laughed rudely at her daughter-in-law's work, saying that her destiny was to carry ducks and scrub floors. Julia dreamed of becoming a nurse, but never graduated from college because of family problems. For as long as she could remember, her father was a heavy drinker, and her mother was struggling to make ends meet, working several jobs at once. This eventually caused her premature death. Julia will always remember her mother's words the day before she left. When you get married, always think of me and the life I've lived. And don't be in a hurry to give your heart to the first man you meet. But think it over carefully. Grace whispered and closed her eyes. Unfortunately, despite her mother's admonition, Julia had made the mistake of marrying Dustin, who had first turned her head and then made her his housekeeper. But what surprised Julia most of all was that her deceased mother-in-law was not at all like a sickly woman. To the surprise of everyone she knew, Rose had taken ill and spent weeks in bed, complaining that she couldn't get up because of severe internal weakness. Julia even offered to bring a doctor from her department to the house, but Laura firmly refused. "No, I don't need your doctors. I'd rather go to a trusted specialist in private practice. I am, used to comfort and do not want to be treated on a general basis." Julia pressed her lips together resentfully. "You shouldn't say that, Laura. I want what's best for me." The mother-in-law only grinned. "I don't need your advice. You better take care of your husband and keep your eyes open. And something he goes to me in front of my eyes, not fed. I've never had such a thing. I used to take care of my late husband from head to toe. Clothes always ironed, shoes shined, and the fridge was bursting with food, to say the least." Julia's cheeks flushed with shame. "So I'm supposed to shine Dustin's shoes?" I'm his wife, not his maid. And what can I do about the fact that he dines and lunches in restaurants? Forgive me, but I can't cook gourmet food. But I do know a lot of delicious, simple recipes. Dustin, on the other hand, is all about the delicacies. Laura looked at her sister-in-law with distaste. Fool, you will live with You will immediately realize that the man must be firmly in hand, or you will go to another, and then you will cry. But it will be too late, nothing can help. My mother-in-law's words are forever etched in my memory. Julia never offered to help her again. Of course, on the face of it, there was nothing special about it. Millions of women all over the world face similar situations and live on. All the more so because Julia was used to her male colleagues acting as commanders. So it was with Dustin, who immediately took the upper hand and began to behave as if he had done Julia a great favor by marrying her. As she visited Laura's grave for the 4th time in a row, the grave itself was in perfect condition. The earth had not yet settled, and there was not a blade of grass on the plot itself. Taking out a handkerchief, Julia decided to wipe the photograph once more, and then touch her lips to it. She couldn't say she enjoyed it, but she wanted to pay her respects to a woman who, though she had not been a gift in life, still deserved to be treated normally. But she didn't have time to do it. She heard Fred's quiet voice behind her. Julia, don't do this, please. I beg you very much. She turned around sharply. Don't do it. Why? The gravedigger shrugged his shoulders. I don't know, Julia, but I feel there's clearly something wrong with this grave. Can you believe it? A woman in a black shawl came here recently. Anyway, she was acting really weird, you know. No, I don't understand. What does that have to do with a woman? Was she an acquaintance or a relative of Laura's? I didn't really know my mother-in-law when she was alive, so I don't know all her acquaintances. And I don't think I should be surprised that a woman in a headscarf showed up here. Julia's remark seemed perfectly reasonable to Fred. He couldn't tell about his inner secret gift that his late grandmother had given him. It all sounded ridiculous to a normal person. After all, there really are no fortune tellers, prophets, or minds. But in spite of that, Fred still had in his mind the memory of that terrible incident on the river when he almost died, but at the last moment changed his mind and saved his life. After thinking for a moment, Fred said, I'm sorry, Julia. I probably shouldn't have interfered. Believe me, I didn't do it on purpose. Julia smiled, but still did not kiss the photos of her mother-in-law. Something in Fred's words seemed strange and even in some way alarming. In general, the whole situation seemed ridiculous and absurd from the beginning. Why did Laura specify in her will that it was Julia who should take care of her grave? After all, when she was alive, she did not do it and considered her daughter-in-law at best a servant, which by means of a favorable marriage decided to get herself all the profits of her son. For many people remained a secret that shortly before Dustin's wedding mother-in-law insisted that he drew up a prenuptial agreement. Son, take my word for it, it's for the best. They may not be puppies, but they're all puppies. They're just waiting for rich people to screw them over and leave them with nothing. I know them. I've seen them, Laura said. Dustin shrugged. Sometimes he marveled at his mother's foresight, who, like an experienced she-wolf, sensed danger and skillfully avoided the traps set by hunters. Okay, Mom, no problem. I was thinking of doing something like that myself. I'm glad you're supportive. I mean, I don't know how life will turn out. What if I fall out of love with Julia? Laura had her predatory smile on her lips. At that moment, she was sure it would be so. After standing at her mother-in-law's grave for a moment longer, Julia decided to go home. After all, she had honored her husband's request, no matter what. She could tell from the gravedigger's face that he wanted to tell her something, but was shy. "Something wrong, Fred?" The boy hesitated for a moment. Then he said quietly, "Can I walk you to the bus stop? To be honest, I'm a little nervous. As soon as I found out that you go to this grave, I immediately lost my peace. Mark my words, there's something wrong with it." "But what is it?" "I don't know. Unfortunately, I didn't take part in that funeral. Your mother-in-law was buried by other people. We gravediggers here are divided into sectors and districts. Sometimes we don't see each other for a month. So we only meet at the gatehouse," Fred explained. Julia smiled, but refused Fred's offer. "I'm sorry. No offense. I'd rather go myself sometime. You see, I'm married, and if my husband sees me with you, he's bound to make a scene. I wouldn't want that." The gravedigger nodded understandingly, as if he had not realized that Julia was married. Of course, at that moment neither Fred nor Julia had any idea that their meeting at the graveside had already been captured on a hidden video camera. The small, peephole-like device was cleverly hidden in the niche of a neighboring tomb, from where Laura's grave had a very good view. And the most curious thing was that the camera had been installed not by Dustin at all, but by a girl named Sarah, who had been his lover for several months now. It was this red-haired beauty who wanted to watch Julia humiliate herself and come to the grave of her unloved mother-in-law to pay her respects. "I don't understand her at all, the Julia of yours. Has she no pride at all? Your mother treated her worse than a servant. If Laura had treated me like that, I'd never have come to her grave. Not only that, I wouldn't have shown up at the cemetery or attended the funeral," she said repeatedly. Dustin grinned, "But people are different, and Julia is a servant by nature. You probably know that people are divided into wolves and sheep. Here's an edited version. So she's a sheep, and I'm a wolf who's used to taking what I think I need from life," Dustin stated. Sarah looked admiringly at her lover, who at that moment seemed to her the embodiment of masculinity and strength. In fact, Dustin was not, nor did he have a flashy appearance or inner charisma. He was short, with a small round belly and sweaty palms, which he always tried to wipe on his pants before shaking hands. Perhaps if he had graduated from a theater school, he would have gotten the roles of small scoundrels, capable of small or big meanness. But at first, when Sarah had suggested installing a hidden camera in the cemetery, he had been against it. At that moment, Dustin was only concerned with the inheritance of his late mother, who had made a rather tricky will, with many clauses based on unconditional compliance with the last will of the deceased. At the same time, Dustin could not be said to have loved his mother too much. Most likely, he simply respected her, but nothing more. He had never known his father, had only seen him in photographs. According to his mother, Bobby died in a car accident, which was 90% likely staged by his competitors. Since then, Laura had never been able to get together with anyone else and lived the life of a recluse, holding her late husband's business tightly in her hands. Laura spent a lot of effort and energy raising her son, whom she wanted to see as a strong and uncompromising businessman. Often to build up his will and character, she locked him in a dark closet for some misdemeanor and did not let him out until the boy asked for forgiveness. Dying this way, Laura hoped that her son would turn out something worthwhile. But in fact, all her thoughts and fantasies turned out to be simple illusions, which were not destined to come true. At school, Dustin was often offended, and to avoid it, the boy made friends with bullies, reinforcing the alliance with pocket money allocated to him by his mother. The businesswoman learned too late that her son had long ago become a cash cow for the local gang who took him under their wing. However, there was nothing Laura could do about it. Dustin had grown up, stepped into adulthood, where the turbulent waters of big business awaited him. But no matter how much freedom Laura gave her son, he still sought her advice and was afraid to do business at his own risk. True, in his mother's opinion, he lacked an inner mental core, which, in fact, makes a man a man. And of course, she did not say it out loud, but she was well aware that by nature Dustin was weak and could not become a leader. But Laura herself had plenty of all these qualities. The main ones were meanness and cunning, which Laura had used against her enemies many times, and allies too. Kissing Dustin on the cheek, Sarah asked cautiously, "Listen, what was your mother's diagnosis? Why did she leave so quickly? You had money, didn't you? And the treatment could have been organized well." "What really happened to her?" Dustin shrugged. "I don't really know. Mother had always been secretive about it. Mitchell, the private doctor, was the only one who had a good handle on it. I tried to talk to him, but he was so quiet, I couldn't get a word out of him." Sarah sighed sympathetically, feeling nothing for a woman she hardly knew. Sarah was quite happy with her current position as a favorite of wealthy businessmen. After all, she was well aware that Dustin would soon inherit his late mother's estate and gain even more power and influence in the ranks of the business elite. And Sarah was also very confused by the presence of so many clauses in Laura's will. It seemed that before going into the next world, this cunning lady had carefully worked out her will, not forgetting to place the emphasis where it was necessary. Sarah didn't really have to worry about that. She was satisfied with the fact that Dustin gave expensive gifts, took her to restaurants and spent nights with her in an elite hotel, where the number of stars was simply exorbitant. But the camera installed in the cemetery was more of a whim to once again mock the unfortunate Julia, who was not even aware of the covert surveillance. Dustin was quite loyal to the whims of his mistress, because he had long ago fallen out of love with his wife and seriously considered divorce. Of course, in her will, Laura left Julia almost nothing, except the duties of going to the cemetery and cleaning the grave. The businessman himself considered his mother's wish as the last taunt she threw in the face of her former daughter-in-law. After all, he still remembered well how she despised Julia, calling the hospital a dump. Fortunately, Julia managed to get home without incident. She was now aware of the sun's harmful effects and tried to avoid being exposed to it. But there was something good in all this. At first, Julia didn't even realize what she liked about walking in the cemetery. But then she realized that thanks to visits to her late mother-in-law, she was able to meet a pleasant gravedigger, Fred, who saved her and helped her to come to her senses. But Fred himself, as they call it, fell for her at first sight. There was something about Julia that made the guy's heart flutter with delight at the mere thought of a future meeting. On the other hand, how would they meet if Julia didn't come to the cemetery anymore? There was a chance, though. As she was saying goodbye, she left Fred her phone number, and when he took from her hands a sheet of paper with clearly written numbers, it seemed to him that it burned his palm. I guess that's what happens when you receive something that is of special value to you. and Fred was well aware that he had no chance of furthering his relationship with Julia. What could they possibly have in common? He's a gravedigger working at the city cemetery. Hardly any woman dreams of union with such a man, especially when married. Back in Stephen's lodge, he poured himself a cup of tea and sat down in a chair with a sad look. The elderly caretaker immediately understood what the matter was, but did not pursue the subject, not wanting to make the boy uncomfortable. But who among us has not fallen in love at least once in his life? After all, love is such a beautiful feeling, which is subject to all without exception, young or old. All ages are subject to love. When Julia left, Fred's mood had soured considerably. When would she come now, and would she come at all? What can he hope for? Why torture his heart and soul with meaningless dreams and fantasies? After all, everything is as clear as day. They were too different to be together. Stephen was silent for a moment, and then said, wanting to support his friend, "They don't take it to heart. I understand you as well as anyone." Fred raised an eyebrow in surprise. Yes, I do, don't doubt it. I used to chase after Rose myself. She was supposed to marry someone else, a tall, handsome athlete. He was a swimmer, and I was stocky, but not tall enough. You know, height matters to women, too. But I didn't give up and fought for my happiness. I gave flowers, inexpensive gifts, of course. Where does a truck driver get a lot of money? Well, it was my care and attention that won Rose over. We got married the same year. We lived together honorably. 40 years. I went to work at the cemetery for her, too. Every day I come to her grave. I live in perfect condition. I planted my favorite flowers. You can't come all the way out here, can you? I water them twice a day, keep them clean. The old caretaker's story touched Fred's heart. The tenderest strings of all possible strings. For himself, he had long considered Stephen a friend, or even a father. After all, it was the caretaker who had saved him when he had contracted severe bronchitis while homeless and nearly given his soul to God, unable to buy medicine. Stephen found Fred at a bus stop when he was suffering from a high fever, teetering on the brink of life and death. So, do you need any help? Come on, I don't live too far away. I'll help you, you bet I will. Fred struggled to lift his eyelids and looked with surprise at the older man, in whose eyes he saw a real desire to help. I need some medicine. I don't have any money. I can't work. I tried to apply to the social fund, but there is a sin all ended. I'm left with only greenery. I'd like some antibiotics, Fred said with difficulty. Stephen didn't ask any more questions, but went straight to the pharmacy. He didn't ask how Fred had ended up on the street or why he didn't have a home. What was there to talk about now? Stephen looked sympathetically at his guest, realizing that the past could not be brought back, and that, let's start a new life. And I won't let you roam around anymore. I work in a cemetery, my friend. But you could use a strong hand there. So when you get better, come to my gatehouse. I'll give you a corner and give you a job. Can you take my word for it? You won't be left without a piece of bread. Fred looked at his savior with gratitude and mentally vowed to start a new life. Perhaps if it hadn't been for Stephen in Fred's life, he wouldn't have succeeded in this task and would probably have ended up in the city cemetery. Only not as an employee, but as a deceased, unknown homeless man. Upon entering the house, the first thing Julia did was head to the bathroom for a cool shower. After all, after that baking heat outside, It was cozy and calm at home. Tomorrow she had to work another shift in therapy, where she had to work to the limit because of the shortage of nursing staff. Julia rarely complained about fate, never argued with the head of the department, who valued her for her performance and reliability. Who else would agree to go out on his day off, and even in this heat? And only Julia, showing sympathy, made concessions. Many people mistakenly thought that Julia did it to get a promotion or some other benefits, but she was not at all good at sucking up. And if she did help in any way she could, she did so only out of sincerity. Dustin was gone by the time she got home. Most likely he made another important deal that was far more important to him, been taking care of his mother's grave. Julia shook her head, then turned on the television just to get her mind off things. He had become her only friend to brighten her loneliness, while her husband was at work almost 24 hours a day. Frankly speaking, Julia didn't quite understand why he needed so much money. It was enough to live on. Though not such a course that yachts and steamships, but still they do not starve and can afford a lot of things that in her childhood Julia had never even dreamed of. Of course, she realized that Dustin had grown up in a different family, accustomed to luxury and wealth. And given that he was raised by someone like Laura, it was foolish to assume that he would grow up different from his mother. Julia looked sadly at the black frame photo of her mother-in-law, and then gloomed. Deep down, she was very hurt that they had never reconciled in her lifetime. At one point, she even began to blame herself for not repenting to her mother-in-law. Shortly before her passing that fateful day, she had been on shift when Dustin told her the sad news over the phone. Julia also wanted to help, to participate in the organization of the funeral. But her husband flatly refused to help, as if she were a stranger to him. As it happened, Julia did not take part in the funeral, and it was not because of the strained relationship between her and the late Laura. Julia rightly believed that you can't hold a grudge in your heart forever. After all, everything comes to an end, so why go into the next world holding a grudge against your loved ones? She never got an answer to this question. At the same moment, the young gravedigger Fred decided once again to go around the cemetery to see the scope of work for the coming day. In addition to digging graves, he had to maintain the cemetery's territory in proper condition, mowing the lawn, as well as occasionally trimming the trees growing around the perimeter and along the alley. And of course, he wasn't the only one doing it, and all the labor was evenly distributed among all the employees. Even Stephen did not sit idle and often took part in cleaning the surrounding areas. But for the grave of his late wife he took care of in his spare time. It so happened that many people themselves brought wreaths to the grave of Laura, who still did not give him peace. From a distance he saw a woman in a black shawl. She stood at the cross like a marble statue. The gravedigger's heart beat harder. Without wanting to, he quickened his step, and deciding to pass quickly, turned around to look at the face of the stranger. But as Fred approached the grave, the mysterious lady was ahead of him and was the first to meet his gaze, and what Fred saw made him uneasy. He felt dizzy, his eyes darkened, as if he had drunk a large dose of liquor in one sitting. No, that's just impossible. I'm imagining it. A hallucination caused by the heat, the gravedigger assured himself. He stood frozen in place. His astonishment was simple. The woman in the black shawl looked exactly like the deceased Laura. Fred was stunned, not knowing what to do next. Guessing what was going on with the gravedigger, the stranger grinned and remarked in a wryly husky voice, "Why are you frozen, my dear? You should go about your business." Stop staring at me. You've got your own amusement, haven't you? Fred shuddered and, trying to chase away the intrusive visions, hurried toward the keeper's lodge. When Stephen saw Fred, pale as chalk, he became alarmed. "Fred, what do you like? Did something happen, or did you overheat in the sun?" "Well, sit down and cool off. Have some tea, or you might faint heat stroke. You know, chance is a tricky thing. You never know when it's going to happen." Fred looked at Stephen with a frightened look, then said, "I saw a live admirer at the very grave where Julia came today." Stephen shook his head doubtfully. "I don't think so. I think you're mistaken. It's all nonsense. I hope you're not saying it's her twin sister. There's just no such thing." But Fred persisted. He urged the caretaker to call the police. The older man looked anxiously at the gravedigger. "Fred, are you sure you haven't overheated in the sun? What am I going to tell them? That the employee saw the doppelgänger of the deceased on the grave? It's funny, honestly." "It doesn't matter what's funny. I could be charged with false summons, which, that's punishable. It's administrative, but it still doesn't take the responsibility off me." Fred looked wistfully at the caretaker, but he didn't retract his words. Moreover, he grabbed the receiver of the landline phone to call the police personally. That's when Stephen realized that something strange was going on. After all, in the morning, Fred had been perfectly normal, but now he resembled a madman who had seen a ghost and thought it was more alive than anyone else. Fred had to make a lot of effort to explain to the duty officer what had happened and why he needed help. Fortunately, he was lucky. The police showed up at the cemetery a few minutes later, as the patrol car was just in the area. After listening to the gravedigger's confused story, the police officers grinned and followed him to Laura's grave. By and large, the law enforcers didn't even know where to begin. But when the stranger in the black scarf saw the officers, she immediately ran away, arousing their serious suspicions. Of course, the aged woman could not run far and was detained at the same minute. At first, the policemen took her for a madwoman, but when they saw the striking resemblance to the portrait on the cross of the late Laura, everything fell into place. Frightened to look at the police, the woman doppelganger immediately laid out the whole truth as it is, and also said that she was ready to make a sincere confession in exchange for leniency in sentencing. "What sentencing? What are you talking about, lady?" "We're not actually going to accuse you of anything," the lieutenant said, barely containing his excitement. But what the stranger said a little later shocked the police officers. In fact, the woman in the dark scarf turned out to be none other than an imaginary dead woman who had faked her own death to avoid possible punishment. All of this came to light a little later when Laura began to talk about her past. Many years ago, after Bobby's death, she, as his maid, decided to pass herself off as the businessman's wife. At the time, Dustin was only a year old, and his mother had died in childbirth. Laura worked for the businessman for the 3rd month and secretly dreamed of becoming his wife, or at least his mistress. But when Laura learned that Bobby died as a result of a faked accident, she realized this is her chance. One can only guess how much effort Laura had to put into pulling off this clever scam. In fact, she herself came from the province, looking for happiness in the big city, dreaming of marrying a rich businessman. When fate gave her such a gift, she decided not to miss it under any circumstances. At taking someone else's surname, changing her status, Laura began to dispose of the late businessman's legacy at her own discretion. At the same time, the cunning swindler gave away little Dustin for her own son, who all this time did not even suspect that he was raised by a mother who was not his own. When Dustin was called in for questioning and shed light on the situation, the businessman almost fainted from shock. All this time he considered his mother a model of inner strength and worldly wisdom. And in fact, Laura turned out to be an ordinary criminal who decided to appropriate someone else's luxurious and rich life. Unfortunately, the case with the cemetery did not pass without a trace for Dustin. On the same day, police officers found a hidden camera installed on a neighboring grave. Soon the operatives quickly enough came to Sarah, who had to confess to her connection with Dustin. Naturally, no criminal punishment for her was out of the question, but Julia already looked at her husband with different eyes. She also realized that for several years she was humiliated and tried to teach her life criminal in the person of Laura. Through a week after the arrest, Julia filed for divorce. At first, Dustin resisted, tried to fix the situation, but Julia had had enough. For too long, this family bullied her, trying to humiliate and self-assert themselves at the expense of others. Already after the divorce, having received the long-awaited freedom, Julia personally thanked Fred, who at the very beginning of their acquaintance warned about the mysterious woman in a black scarf who came to the grave of her mother-in-law. As it turned out, Laura played this performance was not accidental. Someone from Bobby's distant relatives got on her trail and decided to bring her out into the open. Then Laura made up a story about his imaginary illness, so that without consequences to go into the next world and finally erase all traces of himself. But lastly, the insidious woman wanted to once again mock her daughter-in-law, forcing her by will to come to her own grave. It was difficult to say how the situation would have developed further, if not for the premonitions of Fred, who was rewarded with this by his late grandmother. Julia appreciated his abilities, and 6 months after meeting agreed to become his wife. Looking at the beautiful couple of Fred and Julia, Stephen involuntarily caught himself thinking that sometimes life still makes quite surprising turns.
It was evening, and the loud sounds of Indian melodrama could be heard in the house. The cheerful music sounded like a mockery. The wife of Camila's son, the lady of the house, had been doing chores late into the night. Now she was tearfully scrubbing the floors of the spacious 4-room flat, and the music that played when they became husband and wife played in her head, and the words of the registrar came to mind. "Do you, Jennifer Johnson, agree to become the spouse of Nicholas Jones?" Why did she say yes? Gave in to her fiancé's entreaties to live with her mother. She put on a wedding ring, and that took her into a dark world of despair. Nicholas, indulging his mother in everything, didn't believe his wife. The miracle had not happened. Husband was not going to support and protect her in a difficult moment, and mother-in-law was dodgy, weaved intrigues, loaded unnecessary work, slandered on the daughter-in-law. Not the difficulties of family life frightened Jennifer. Offended Nicholas misunderstanding, the injustice of life. And today she scrubbed the floors for the second time, only because the mother of her husband did not believe her that she had already cleaned the whole house in the early morning. In the evening, Nicholas supported his mother, not understanding why his wife is stubborn and cannot do simple housework. Finished with the cleaning, Jennifer quietly snuck into the bathroom and closed. Here she could let her feelings out, rest from the family burden. The well-appointed flat, unlike her rural home, was a joy to bathe in at any time, without heating the cooker. It was a small consolation to Jennifer. She missed the peacefulness of the countryside, her yard, the warmth of communicating with the villagers. Picking up the water, with a snow-white cap of foam, she sank into the tub with pleasure. Once again, she remembered the carefree minutes of her unmarried life, and then the acquaintance with Nicholas and such a sudden wedding. Jennifer had fallen in love with the kind guy on a motorbike at first sight. Nicholas then came to visit his grandmother in the village. One day, driving through the village, he saw a marvelous girl with a black braid down to her waist, a gentle look, and a basket in her hands. It was a marvelous vision, as if a forest nymph had come out of the pages of books. She was walking with a basket of cloudberries, which she had been given by a kind-hearted grandmother for a letter from her son. Nicholas stopped, asked to treat him to a strange berry, which he had never seen before, so the relationship began. The guy surrounded his beloved with care and invited her to live in his luxurious 4-room flat. Jennifer immediately disliked Camila, the city's spoiled woman, who did not like her son. Not one of her son's girls, she had worn out her cunning, and here was a gift from Nicholas, a simple girl from the village, an orphan from Kazan with no family and no tribe. Jennifer buried her parents long ago and lived poorly, alone. She worked as a postmistress, but at the insistence of her husband, she resigned and moved to the city. Why? What for? There was a persistent knock at the door. Camila's irritated voice brought her out of her blissful memories. "Jennifer, you're at it again. How many times have I told you not to shut the door, and how many times can you pour water? You haven't brought a penny into the house yourself. She's a madam, but she takes a bath every day. Open the door immediately, I have to go to the bathroom. I have a scheduled beauty treatment." "Mum, what's wrong?" asked Nicholas, who came running at the screams. "Your wife did not wash my room, I had to do it myself, and I have a backache, I feel sick. The medicine is in the bathroom, I've been trying to persuade her for an hour and she refuses. And she was rude to me. Talk to your wife." "Why are you sassing me again, Mum?" "It's been 15 minutes and I've scrubbed the floors in every room." "No, look at you, you arrogant liar. Get out of my sight." Camila shoved her sister-in-law viciously in the side, causing her to almost fall over. Jennifer, Nicholas said coldly, "Stop arguing with your mom and show her some respect, please. If it's not too much trouble, Your Highness." He turned and walked away, stomping angrily. Day after day, her husband's mother nagged, making up tall tales, complaining to Nicholas about her deteriorating health, with such an ungrateful daughter-in-law. Jennifer baked pies, cooked French and Italian dishes, studied new recipes, watched videos on running a household. Nothing helped. The mother-in-law's main goal was to drive her daughter-in-law out by any means necessary. Kick her out for no reason, not her status. Nicholas is a prominent lawyer, and her late husband was a prosecutor. There were old connections, important people, not the last people in town. Camila was embarrassed by Jennifer, who didn't know how to handle cutlery, dressed gray, plain, and refused to go to salons. Unwillingness to do her hair and manicure pissed her off. When guests, the mother of the husband politely, but coldly owed her Giroetzia daughter-in-law, telling her not to show anyone in front of her. A year of hard, tedious, joyless life passed. Jennifer took a job in a shop near the house as a clerk. Her husband stopped giving her money at her mother's request. At work, the daughter-in-law rested from the endless reproaches, but at home it became even worse. Now Camila reproached her daughter-in-law for her unwillingness to do household chores. "My dear, you are always at work, and my husband must be fed and looked after. I'll talk to my son so he won't let you get out of hand." "Mom, I do everything. I cook in advance, all my things are in order, I clean up morning and night. What's the fashion in which you insist on quitting your job? I'm ashamed you're working as a saleswoman with a husband like that. I'm ashamed of you. Because of you, Nicholas doesn't even leave me any money for the household, and I still have a house to keep in the village, to pay the bills. Oh, Kazan orphan, you don't need to spend our money, you know that. Nicholas buys everything for the house." The arguments upset Jennifer. Later, the mother of the spouse reprimanded her son, as boorishly communicates his wife does not hear her advice. Jennifer was deeply hurt by Camila's words that she was ashamed of her uneducated daughter-in-law. It was painful to remember why she never went to college. Jennifer was the pride of her parents. She graduated from high school with honors and planned to enter the medical academy. But a month after graduation, her parents were in a car accident on their way back from the city. Father died in the hospital, never regained consciousness. Mum fell into a coma. For 6 months, Jennifer traveled to all the hospitals, begging, hoping to save her mother, gave on the paw, begged to appoint an operation. The situation was hopeless. No one could help. Mum never woke up again. Having buried her mother, Jennifer was left an orphan. To live somehow, she worked part-time in a shop, then found a job at the post office. The road to the academy was closed, There was nothing to pay for her studies. Jennifer spent all the money she had saved on hospital and funeral expenses. The hard fate did not bother her mother-in-law. She could not allow a homeless girl from the village to run her house. Camila found a new way to get rid of her daughter-in-law. Nicholas, she told her son, we need an heir. Why can't your wife get pregnant? Mum, it's been so little time. Perhaps it's too soon to talk of children. My dear, a child will help reconcile us all. It's such a blessing. I'll be so happy if you give me a grandchild. The cunning mother-in-law cried and hugged her son. Okay, I'll talk to Jennifer. However, I agree, it's up to me. In the evening, Nicholas pleased his wife with his desire to have children. He didn't say anything about his mother's request. Camila went to extreme measures, which became known later. Jennifer rejoiced at the possibility of becoming a mum. A child could really soften her husband and her life would be much happier. She had lived with the dream of having a child since her wedding, but it had not been possible to have children. Another 6 months passed. Jennifer cried as she held the test strip in her hands, disappointed again. Fear settled in her soul. Her mother-in-law would scream, her husband would support her mother and slam the door angrily. For the second month, he was less often at home. He stayed late at work, met with his mates. Camila was pleased. She had finally broken up the young people. There was one last step to take. One day, Jennifer entered the room and saw Nicholas, who sat with a twisted face of anger. When he saw his wife, he swung round and hit her in the face. Ungrateful bitch. He shouted and threw a packet of pills at her. How dare you lie to me and Mum? Explain to me, what are these? They're pills, but I've never seen them before. Crying with shaking hands, Jennifer read the instructions. They were birth control pills. The weight of the past months of endless humiliation, of frustration, came over her in an instant. She collapsed without feeling, no longer wanting to live and breathe in this cruel world of absurdity. Nicholas, though angry at his wife, felt guilty, could not bring her to her senses himself, called an ambulance. Camila snidely looked at the pills and indifferently escorted her daughter-in-law to the hospital. Mum, why did she do this to me? Bitterly complained Nicholas, complaining to his mother. I told you. The hunchback will be corrected by the grave. Do not dare to forgive such a thing, divorce. You can't do that, Mama. I promised her she'd be happy, but she lied to me too. I'm going to get up early in the morning to visit my wife and have a quiet talk. 3 days later, Jennifer was discharged. She took the bus home. Nicholas did not meet her. He was at work. Waiting for her at home was a suitcase and a note from her husband informing her that they were getting a divorce. Her mother-in-law was triumphant. She kicked Jennifer out without letting her wait for her husband. She was a country bumpkin, and she was still a country bumpkin. You shouldn't have messed us all about. Get out. I can't see you, you snake. You wanted to separate me from my son. It won't happen. Get out. I said get out. I want you out of here right now. The mother-in-law shouted after her, unwilling to stop her anger and triumph at the same time. In the evening, Nicholas learnt that his wife had left. Mum, why didn't Jennifer wait for me? How dare she leave me? Why didn't she say anything? Calm down, son. It was her decision. Camila was careful not to mention the note she had written, copying her son's handwriting. But how? She didn't even leave a note. You two haven't been getting along for a long time. That woman is not good for you. Who's that redneck going to give birth to you? And without children, there's no family, it's an omen. If she did, who would she give birth to? There's no reason to breed without a native simplicity. Look for a wife of status. Having got rid of her daughter-in-law, Camila felt over the moon. She had achieved her goal. It was her plan. For a year, she drank Jennifer a decoction of wormwood, convincing her that this tea was good for women's health. So she hoped to make a young, healthy girl infertile, and then planted pills on her. Nicholas was upset, he thought. Jennifer hadn't forgiven him for the slap. With a longing in his heart, he walked around the room where he smelled her perfume. Sitting down on the bed, he went through the pills. A suspicion crept into his soul. The packets were intact, every single pill in place. Perhaps Jennifer hadn't taken them. He remembered hundreds of moments when his wife had cried and complained about her mother and he hadn't believed it. The load at the opening struck his heart with the pain of irretrievable loss. He himself, with his own hands, had destroyed love. There is no forgiveness, but Jennifer, his beloved, without whom so lonely and dreary, will be able to understand. He would rent a flat for her, and tomorrow he would go to the village to beg forgiveness. An Indian song was playing loudly in the next room. Camila smiled blissfully in triumph. She was more at ease when others were suffering, but her carefree life would not last long. One day she would receive a letter that would turn her whole life upside down, change her character, teaching her to be compassionate, to empathize, to do good. And now she was far from even a moment's regret for her dastardly deed. Nicholas did not immediately get out to the small town where his wife lived before marriage. He had to see the client's case through to the end. A week later, he took a week's holiday and went to see Jennifer. As 2 years ago, to go decided on a motorbike to return the former feelings. He did not inform his mother about his departure. He was offended by her. He tried to avoid talking to her. Camila looked anxiously at her dejected son, hoping that time would heal him. She was already looking for a worthy match for him, an obedient socialite who will distract her Nicholas from sad thoughts. His mother repeatedly tried to talk about divorce, but the son waved away, avoiding an answer. Nicholas settled everything, packed his rucksack secretly from his mother and left the house. It was a clear spring day. Johnson happily set off on his long-awaited journey. Soon he would meet his beloved, whom he missed incredibly. It seemed to him that just today their family would open a new page of life. They would be happy, for he loved Jennifer so much. The road was slippery from the past rain. Prudently, Nicholas wore a helmet, but the wheels could fail. But it did not stop the desire to impress his wife, to revive pleasant memories, move the voice of reason. Johnson accelerated, feeling a rush of energy, freedom and lightness on his soul. It was a 2-hour non-stop drive to the small town. The road went without tarmac, not a living soul. After an hour and a half, Nicholas carelessly slipped into the oncoming lane. At that time, a tractor appeared from behind the corner. It was too late to brake. Nicholas jerked the wheel to the left. The motorbike rammed the bushes, crashed into a tree. The brakes did not work. The wheels began to slip. Johnson was thrown out of the saddle, and he rolled down the slope from the road. He was unlucky with the driver. The driver of the tractor was ex-prison inmate Kevin Reed, who would not want to be investigated again. He braked, hoping to save the arrogant driver, but Nicholas showed no signs of life. So Kevin took his belongings, got back on, and drove off, leaving the motorcyclist to die. In the village, he said nothing about the accident, not even a twinge of conscience. It was an accident. The fault of the tractor driver was not really his fault, and humanity, unfortunately, is inherent in few people. The mother missed her son the same day. She found out that he had taken a week's holiday and did not answer the phone. What a stubborn man, he went to his simple girl. Did she cast a spell on him? Camila knew where her daughter-in-law lived before her marriage, but she was not going to her. She decided that she would bear it for a week, and then she would see. She called her mother in the village and asked if her grandson had turned up. He hadn't. Her son's phone became unavailable, and after a week he still hadn't returned. She decided to go to the village herself, got to her mother, whom she rarely saw and communicated with even less often. The news was shocking. It had been a year since Nicholas had visited his grandmother, called Mrs. Cassandra. He hadn't come to the village a week ago, not yesterday, not the day before. "Do you know Jennifer, the postmistress?" Camila asked her mother. "She's your sister-in-law, your dear. Have you gone completely out of your mind?" The mother was silent, shaking her head. Something sly slipped into her gaze. "Jennifer hasn't been here in a year. She's moved in with you." "How?" "She's been divorced from my Nicholas for a fortnight. What better place to go than back home? She hasn't been here. We're next door to each other, 2 houses down." "Camila, don't make a mess. I know you. Where did you put the kids? They ran away from you, didn't they? They did the right thing." "I raised a bad daughter. You don't come here, you don't help your mother. If it wasn't for Nicholas, I'd be all alone. Mama, you never understood me, and I couldn't stand that simpleton. What use is she? I'm sorry, but I was raising my son. It was hard. He's back on his feet. He hasn't forgotten anyone, and he's my son. I raised him that way." "So you survived, Jennifer? I see you're a simpleton like me, or you've forgotten. What a character you have, Camila." I'm ashamed to have raised a daughter like that. Tell me what happened. Why did the kids run away from you? My son went to Jennifer's. I guess his motorbike isn't in the garage. Where did it go? I don't know, I'm so sad. Camila couldn't hold back any longer. She clasped her hands and wailed. Sonny, where are you, dear son? It's my own fault. My own fault. Let's go to Jennifer together. Maybe they're lurking there, living there. I'll tell you the address, but it's no use. I won't go. Go yourself and don't come back to me alone. It's easier and calmer. You go yourself, I'll call you if the children are found. Camila went to the address, but no one was home. She knocked. She went to the neighbors, but it was the same. Neither Jennifer nor her husband had been there for a year. Nobody had come or knocked. Camila went to the old habit to collect information in the town, in the shop, at the post office, at the club, but Jennifer as in water vanished. With a heavy heart, she returned to town, the trail broken. Acquaintances, friends didn't know where her son was. He never showed up for work. He didn't sign any resignation papers. Nicholas was irretrievably missing. The last desperate step was to file a missing persons report. Another year she padded the thresholds of government agencies, visited her mother in a small town. There was no trace of her son. Later, remorse seized Camila. Nothing could dull the pain of loss. It was impossible to believe in the death of her son. So she lived lonely, remembering the moments when everyone lived together, though not always friendly. Let him live with that simple girl, as long as he was near. Now the house was hopelessly silent. Camila cried at the window all day long with an absent look, but she believed that her son would return. The story by the roadside had a sequel. Nicholas survived. He was rescued by the family of a healer from a small town in the neighborhood where Jennifer lived. It was a very small town of just a few houses. The only people left in it were old people. For all the necessary food things, so small things for the household drove and went to the neighboring town. On that fateful day, the daughter of the Hilowi went to the shop on the road. First she saw a mangled motorbike, and a little further away she noticed Nicholas without feelings. What a grief, he must have crashed. What a handsome man he was. I sighed and shook my head. The girl, her name was Catherine, was trained in first aid, often helping her mother treat people. She checked and realized that the boy was alive, but it was not customary for healers to call an ambulance. They lived in the village as one family. In case of grief, they helped each other. So Catherine ran off to get help. Johnson was taken to Chloe's house. It wasn't good. The victim hadn't been conscious for a week. They searched around the motorbike, but they didn't find any ID, phone, or belongings. They were taken by a resourceful tractor driver, so that there would be no trace of them at all. He just took the things, but he burnt all the papers and even his passport. There was a man, and he's gone, missing. The unknown man came to his senses on the 8th day. A black-eyed beauty with a thick red braid was sitting beside him. When she saw that the sick man opened his eyes, she jumped up and cried out, "Mummy, he's awake, come here." A not young but stately woman came in, bent over him and held his hand. "My dear, you'll live now. Where did you come from? What's your name?" But Nicholas was so weak that he could not speak. He shook his head, trying to say something, but could not utter a word. "Catherine, go and get him some broth and tea. I guess he can't talk. Maybe he'll write something later." The man thought with horror that he couldn't remember his name. Moreover, who he used to be, who he even was, he doesn't know. He frantically fumbled around, trying to get up, mumbled and fell again without feeling. Later, he was given tinctures. The men brought his motorbike, collected parts from it, and wanted to identify the man by it, but somehow forgot about it. It's no use, they thought. After all, the village had hardly developed. A kind man, we need him. If he doesn't remember his former life, it's his fate. Catherine nursed Nicholas, fell in love with him without memory. He was also charmed by this extraordinary, caring girl of fabulous beauty. Over time, Nicholas began to talk a little, turned out to be skillful at all hands. Quickly learned to build, put a log cabin for his native Catherine, equipped it. And so they lived together. Vague pictures of the past came to mind, but the whole did not add up. With some secret excitement, he looked at the cloudberries, and then everything was eclipsed, did not go further memory. Nicholas was no longer himself. He was given a new name, Norman, the papers of a long dead man, buried and not registered as dead. Norman Carter was born. For a long time he couldn't remember where he came from, who he worked for, or why he was on that road. Camila Jones was still waiting for her son's return. Her maternal heart told her he was alive. It had been 5 years since his disappearance. Nicholas had been reported missing. The bleak days had been hard. It seemed as if nothing would happen until she died, but one day she received a letter. A very strange message came from Jennifer's address in a small town. There was only one word on a white sheet of paper: Cloudberry. What the hell is this? The mother-in-law shook the envelope, nothing more, shone the leaf on the window a blank. I told you she was a mad fool. The same day I left for the village. The first thing I did was to go to Jennifer's house. She didn't remember her son's story about how he met his wife. This time the door to the house was open and empty inside. She walked through the rooms as if no one lived there. Dust all around, cobwebs in the corners, the smell of a long uninhabited house. But in the midst of this emptiness, a brand new portrait of a sweet little girl stood on the windowsill. Camila shuddered and cried, Nicholas's bottomless blue eyes staring back at her. Grabbing the portrait, she read the inscription at the bottom, Cloudberry on the back, Caroline Jones. It couldn't be that. How could it be? For 5 years I've been on my own, with my granddaughter growing up next to me. It was Jennifer, the wicked witch. She's the reason I lost my son and hid my granddaughter. What a bastard. Camila howled as she looked at the photograph, stroked the face that bore the features of her precious Nicholas, and then sat down and wept. Tears of remorse poured down in streams. It was she herself who had driven the good girl away. She had given her wormwood to keep her from being a mother. But what a cruel fate. Jennifer's daughter was given to her, and everything was taken away from her. It's karma. Jennifer was wrong to do that. It was getting dark. There was no electricity in the house, so this was not where her daughter-in-law lived. Camila stood up from the floor 5 years older, her heart bleeding. She walked to her mother's house and the door was open, wide open. No one inside, empty and desolate. She had not visited her mother for a year. She had given up hope of finding her son. She had stopped calling. Her mother had died without her. There's no one now, alone in the whole world. I'm sorry, Mom, I'm sorry. Where are you? Camila clutched her temples and fell senseless. She woke up in the dark. There was a cold smell from the door. She had to find her granddaughter and Jennifer to find out what was wrong with her mother. There was no electricity in the house. She went into the kitchen. Like when she was a child, the candles were in a drawer. I lit them, put a glass, and sat alone in the semi-darkness on the chair where I sat as a small, carefree, mischievous girl 45 years ago. The glare played on the wall. The silence was incredible. The world froze here in an instant, in no hurry, no sacrifice required. What happened to her soul? The city had taken everything good out of her, made her a cruel and wicked girl. And it's not square meters, water from the tap that you need to stay alive. That's the feeling when you realize you're a real person. Only a small town can reveal the soul. Camila should have been born again, sitting alone on that chair, in the semi-darkness, which her mother had not thrown away because she had waited all her life for her daughter's return. In that moment, she came home with her whole soul. Grief helped her to realize the emptiness of her meaningless life. The clock ticked, as if counting down the time of rebirth. Night fell and business had to be postponed until tomorrow. Camila unraveled the prim bump on her head and braided her hair. She woke with the dawn in the morning, anxiously opened the wardrobe in her former room, going through the dresses she had worn when she was young. This was where she had lived until she got married and met a promising guy studying to be a lawyer. Later they left the small town and bought a one-room flat in the big city. The clothes were too small, no doubt. I slammed the doors, went into my mother's room, opened the wardrobe. Weekend dresses hung in rows. Everything was in perfect order. Even the perfume hadn't weathered off. By old habit, her mother walked around the village only in skirts or dresses. Camila stood in indecision. She dared not take her mother's things. It was not clear what had happened. It was bad enough to wear the things of the deceased, but she would certainly be told that her mother was dead. Emboldened by this thought, Camila chose a plain, straight-cut monochrome dress and changed. The trouser suit she'd arrived in was angrily tossed into the dresser, as if a frog had taken off its skin, transforming into a beautiful maiden. In her 50s, Camila was a slim, beautiful woman, but the strict outfits, dark things aged her. Now she was happily fidgeting in front of the mirror, as if rejuvenated a dozen years in this simple old-fashioned dress. It was time to make inquiries, stock up on groceries, put the house in order. I went outside, dizzy from the marvelous country air. I stood enjoying the ringing silence. I went into the neighboring house. I thought how I hadn't thought to go to the house since the evening. The old owner was milking a cow. She looked in, startled to see Camila in her neighbor's dress. "Hello, Mrs. Kimberly." "Don't you be sick," too, the old woman muttered quietly. "Tell me, where's Mummy?" "It's fate to die with a daughter like that." "No way." "You, my dear, don't deserve to know the truth," said the neighbor harshly, turning away. "Tell me, I beg of you, is she alive?" Mrs. Kimberly stood up, picked up the milking pan, and strode to the porch. The silence dragged on. "Now, you get out of here. I've nothing more to say, and don't come here and say anything more. It's up to you to decide how you want to live your life. Michael, get Blanca out of here and get this one out of here too." She mumbled under her breath, but Camila heard her. She didn't get anything else. Michael, the neighbor's son, passed by without a glance and didn't speak. Camila stood there for a moment, crumpled, and then walked angrily away. She passed 5 other neighbors, 2 of whom had already left the small town. The houses were padlocked, the vegetable garden abandoned in high summer, everything overgrown with grass. The other 2 neighbors she knew couldn't explain anything. She said her mother had moved away. She didn't say where. But the small town was thriving. A new shop had opened. People were farming, putting the cattle out to pasture. The hospital was working. There was a poster on the local notice board advertising a holiday home by the river. Inquiries from the inhabitants led nowhere. Camila decided she had to start her life over. It was no coincidence that she received a strange message. A portrait of her granddaughter, changing will earn her forgiveness. Fate would have mercy on her. She decided to start with a temporary move. The flat in the city was on the alarm system. But she didn't have to worry. But she didn't take any things with her. Her old tastes seemed unacceptable for the town. Camila Jones went round the shops, bought suitable outfits for work and everyday life. She spent the rest of the evening tending to the household, going through the kitchen utensils, all in a deplorable state, some chipped, some old, the floors cracked, the wallpaper unchanged for years. Now she realized what a poor state the house was in need of repair. She had not thought about it, having left her mother alone in the village. She only threw in a piece occasionally, sending money a couple of times a year. How did mother live here alone was unfathomable, and a bitter thought befell the neglectful daughter. What if her son had left her so alone? Would life have been easy? Her heart was troubled. How could she do that? No, she deserved everything that happened to her. You can't be selfish, thinking only of yourself. Things are going to be different now, she proclaimed into the void, wiping away her tears. She cleaned the house until evening, made a list of things to buy in the city. I thought I'd go to the local office to find out when my mother had last paid the light bill. It turned out that it was only like 3 months ago. The bills were paid. The landlady herself came to visit. Camila was wary, but the payment was accepted, and in the evening the electricity came on, illuminating the rooms with a cold, dim light. In the morning, Camila left for the city. She drove her car to the village, leaving it at the gate for the night. But after thinking a little, she went to her neighbor's house, sneaked into the house, knocked. It was open. The house was clean, spacious, everything was in order. It seemed that her son had done his best to repair the house, and it stabbed her heart that she herself had never helped anyone. The angry landlady was about to send her away. "Mrs. Kimberly, I'm sorry, I've been mean. My bad." "What a sly fox. I won't tell you anything. Just so you know. You're right, it's too early to forgive. Mother, I must find my son and granddaughter in front of them guilty. So why did you come to me? Go back to your place. Nobody needs you here. I decided to live here for the summer. I was invited," she muttered quietly, remembering about the letter. "What do you want from me?" "I'm going to town, to the hardware store. I want to make repairs to my mother. I came here to ask if you need anything to buy." "Buy them all. Have you decided?" Mrs. Kimberly grinned slyly. "It's out of the goodness of my heart. What can I do for you?" "Oh, my dear, I can't pretend to be angry for long. Come to me, I was babysitting you while your mother was at work. To her amazement, all Mrs. Kimberly's sternness was gone. She hugged Camila, wiping away her tears. "I'll write you a list, and I have to ask my son. He wanted to go into town too. Maybe he'll come with you." Mrs. Kimberly's son was a little older than she was. As children, they were friends and quarrelsome, annoying each other with mischief. At 15, Michael left his mother, going to school to study electrician, and then returned here to find a job, got married, made an extension to the house. We started a household and lived together. How painful it was for her mother to see it. Her daughter got married and never came back. "Hello, Michael." Camila finally found the right words. "Hi, Meanie." Michael smiled, remembering her past offenses. "I'm going to the city. Your mother has made a list. Maybe you should come with me too? You're not going to kill me?" The irony was uncalled for. When she was a child, she asked to drive his motorbike, but she lost control, drove off a bridge into a river. They were rescued, but the motorbike was banned. Michael didn't forgive her and stopped communicating altogether. He'd do little things, like scare me with caterpillars or drop off mice. "Don't worry, I've been driving for over 20 years. When my husband gave me a car for my wedding, I learned right away." "Did you bury your husband?" "My mother told me. Sorry to remind you." "It's all right. Where's your wife?" "She died. She went out on the ice in the spring. She wanted to rinse the laundry. It got sucked in. She was not saved." Michael said quietly and turned away. "I'm sorry, I didn't know. It was a long time ago. Let's go to town. Wait, I'll change." While Michael was getting ready, a girl with a bag over her shoulder ran up to Camila. "Hi, do you live in this house?" "Yes, I'm here to see my mother. Here's a letter to this address. Please sign here." "Thank you, girl. Come and visit if you have time." "I've got to go. Goodbye." Camila Jones turned the envelope round. It had her mother's address on it, but it was addressed to Camila. She opened it anxiously, wondering if someone was trying to teach her a lesson or take revenge. On a white sheet of paper in large letters was the single word wormwood. Camila shrieked, dropped the sheet. Jennifer learned that by the evil machinations of her mother-in-law, she could have been left infertile. How could that be? Maybe she peeped on her while she was in the kitchen making her daughter-in-law's herbal tea. "What are you standing there with your mouth open?" Michael asked, approaching. Seeing the leaf, he picked it up, reading the strange message with amazement. "What is this nonsense? Did you get a letter? Your interlocutor is obviously a little verbal." Michael laughed, but quickly stopped. Seeing that, Camila stands in a daze with a lost look. "Let's go." The road was silent, not even music on. Michael was dozing in the passenger seat. Then he opened his eyes and blurted, "Your mom came to see us a week ago." "What?" Camila braked sharply, which almost bumped Michael's forehead. "Hey, take it easy. Drop me off. I'd rather walk. You're not very good at driving." "I'm sorry, but why didn't Mrs. Kimberly tell me? I was so worried. Do you know what I've been through? I buried her in my mind." "Don't shout." "What's going on?" Camila said it quietly and pulled over to the curb. "I don't know. They were whispering in the kitchen without me, and my mother forbade me to talk about it. Don't ask me anything. I'm going to go. We're here." "Wait. I'll find out for myself. Don't say anything. Let's go." The shopping trip took longer than they thought. It was getting dark by the time they'd filled the boot in the back seat. Camila persuaded Michael to spend the night in her flat. He walked round the rooms for a long time with a look of amazement. "It's like a museum. What a place. You must have been crazy to live in the country. The living room alone is as big as your mother's house. Yeah, Mom's living in squalor and her daughter's living in luxury." "Michael, I know what I'm talking about. Come on. Here, you're going to sleep on the couch. Let's go. I'll feed you. Caviar and lobster. I'm coming." "Ugh, you furry hedgehog," she playfully replied with a childhood nickname. Camila thought that it was unbearable to live alone. Caring for others gave her energy. Michael was pensive, looking at his hostess with alienation. The evening was not going well. The guest was obviously hiding something from her, but Camila Jones did not question him, more him. The letters were leading her to some goal, like stages of a test she had to pass. Michael got up in the early morning and got Camila up. He would not leave his mother alone for long. He had to help with the chores. They came back when the neighbor had already put the cow out to graze. "Why didn't you come back yesterday?" "Every hour counts. I can't cope on my own, and it's scary to spend the night alone." She grumbled, then smiled and invited me to tea. We unloaded the shopping. Camila had brought a set of pots and pans as a present for her neighbor. She knew that pots and pans were the trouble with village housewives. Mrs. Kimberly sighed but accepted the gift. The hut was clean, cozy, and warm. The hostess brewed tea, put a wicker with lambs, jam, and honey. The quiet morning in the village was peaceful. Camilla took a sip of tea and looked at the hostess with bewilderment. "Something bitter." "It's bitter for you. Others must have been sweet, remember." "Is it with wormwood?" She choked and coughed up tears. "And you eat it with cloudberry jam. It won't be so bitter," Mrs. Kimberly said with a sly squint. Camila shuddered. Tears ran down her cheeks. She jumped up, ran out without looking at anyone, and ran away. Earlier it was impossible to be pierced by this. Nothing troubled her heart. She did harm to her daughter-in-law with a light hand. But now her conscience, which had been sleeping for many years, awoke and stirred her soul. She sat on the bench at the gate and could not calm down for a long time. There were no more thoughts, only tears flowed unrestrainedly, washing away the blackness that lived in her soul. Granddaughter Caroline was to relieve the bitterness of life. A little while later she went to sort out her things, then fiddled in the kitchen until evening, took everything out to the veranda, painted both the ceiling and the walls, having changed her mind about wallpapering. She just cleaned the floors, and contrary to village tradition, laid a carpet. The old kitchen furniture was falling apart, in need of repair. She persuaded Michael to help, who willingly patched the holes. Camila looked at Michael with admiration. He's a good man. In his 50s and early 50s, he's still a handyman. Michael laughed at the carpet and told her to paint the floors. "Help me set up the furniture. It's up to me to decide what to do." "City folk, you're all cuckoo." "Oh, for crying out loud." "All right, I'll keep the carpet for now, and I'll paint the floors later. You're going to throw that carpet away in 3 days. We'll watch you when you're on the river. I bought a Hoover you've never even heard of." Michael looked at Camila in a friendly way, jokingly pushing her, looking playful. "Oh, Michael, stop pushing me. We have grandchildren to nurse." "God didn't give me grandchildren." He said bitterly, "My son is a border guard. He won't show his nose. It's been 10 years since we've seen each other." "Son? I don't know anything about you. I don't know about anyone. I only cared about myself. After my mother died, he cut off all contact with us. He left like a ghost. He writes letters once a year. He settled down all by himself. He got a flat far away from us, but he didn't have a family." In an outburst of pity, Camila hugged Michael, and he suddenly responded, embraced her and kissed her on the lips. Camila was taken aback. "Have you eaten too much white wine in your old age? You know nothing. And I was in love with you as a child, and you city crazy first attacked me." "Me? I don't need any more help from you. I'll see you around." Michael turned and walked away. He muttered to himself, "That's right. You're the one who's trying to teach me a lesson." "My what?" "Wait, spit it out. You can't talk." Michael walked over to Camila, kissed her again, and left quickly. Camila Jones stood in a daze for a minute, then sat down to drink tea in the newly transformed kitchen, the surroundings sparkling clean. Michael had hung the chandelier she'd looked out for in the house, the pendulum clock on the wall, adding to the coziness. Only the old furniture spoilt the overall impression. So the furniture was worth updating. You could order yourself new sofas, a lounge, an armchair, a bed for Mum. How easy were these things to do now? Why hadn't she thought of Mum's comfort before? For a week, Camila made repairs, ordered furniture, while waiting for delivery, painted ceilings and walls. For more than 10 years, she had been sitting on the sofa with soap operas, and now she was working, impressing the neighbors with unprecedented vigor for a mature woman. In the evenings, her back and arms ached, but Camila did not complain. She was patient, glad that God had given her the strength for such an important work. During that week, Michael visited her more than once, helping with the repair of wardrobes, rearranging furniture. Camila got used to him, Communication became warm. More and more often he sat up late, remembered the past, made plans. Michael refused to talk about her mother. At parting, he hugged her like his own, but he did not allow any liberties, kissing her innocently on the cheek. On the 8th day, the renovation was finished. The old kitchen sets were dismantled for firewood. For her mother, she had chosen a color that was not stained, a pleasant shade of gray that gave the kitchen a new glow. With new furniture and fluffy carpets, the house began to play with magical colors. Having put all her energies into renovating the house, Camila exhausted her energy, fell asleep on the new sofa, and woke up to a knock at the door. The postmistress came. The game was dragging on. The relatives sent a parcel. She opened it anxiously. This time there was no message, just 2 jars with some contents. I opened them carefully and tasted. Wormwood and cloudberry are the same thing. It's a vicious circle. I chose the right path a long time ago. I renovated my mother's house. I realized what I'd done to my family. I lost my son. Tell me, haven't I suffered enough? Is it too soon to forgive me? It's too soon. You don't understand. You didn't lock the door, did you? They'll steal my beauty. You scared me. Camila shuddered. The door. What nonsense. What didn't I realize? You have to close the door. That's not what I meant. You just said that. I didn't say anything else. Are you all kidding me? No one. You're the one who did all the renovations. You don't want to talk about it. Go on. Don't make a mess. I just came by to help us with the housework. My mom asked me to. All right, I'll be back in an hour. Michael staggered a bit and went out. Camila cooked breakfast in her head, solving the problem she'd been given. If Jennifer knows of her intrigues, then Camila must go through it too. First to feel the bitterness of life, and then there will be hope in the distance and Hope and Cloudberry, her granddaughter. Camila twirled the jar of wormwood infusion, thought, and drank it down. She choked, drank water, and collapsed. By evening, Michael found Camila lying in the kitchen, sound asleep. There was no way to wake her up. He brought her to the hall, put her on the sofa. She looked charming in her sleep. He decided to stay close to her, to wait for her to wake up, so he locked the door. He walked to the kitchen. His eye caught a jar with some kind of potion on the bottom. He smelled something familiar, remembered the inscription in the letter he'd received recently, wormwood, and thought that Camila's mother had overdone the punishment, but he wouldn't interfere. Let things take their course. They say that Camila herself has been scheming against her daughter-in-law for a year and a half, playing her with her fate and her relationship with her son. He switched off the light and lay down on the bed in the bedroom. Fell asleep quickly, in a sound, farmer's healthy sleep. Camila woke up when it was dark outside the window, surprised that she had no memory of the previous day at all. She opened her eyes and squealed in horror. A dark silhouette stood on her doorstep. She ran to the bedroom, closed the door, sighed, looked at the bed, the scream stuck in her throat. In the semi-darkness, she could see Jennifer sitting with her legs overhung, threatening her with her finger, whispering that she had ruined her unborn children. Jennifer. Jennifer, I'm sorry, for God's sake, it's all my fault, don't hold it against me. An ominous silence was her answer. When Camila looked up in fear, she saw that there was no Jennifer, but a man sleeping on the bed. She jumped up, her temples pounding, her head spinning. She listened, silence, only sniffling. Camila looked out into the living room. No one was there. Switching on the bedroom light, she breathed a sigh of relief. Michael, you scared me. But he was sleeping soundly as a baby, not waking up from his screams. Camila switched off the light and went into the kitchen. There was someone standing at the doorstep. A dark silhouette walked quickly towards Camila. Dazed with horror, she skidded back into the bedroom. But there stood the mother, with an angry expression on her face, moved her whole body, approached, threatened with a finger. Why have you ruined the children, you foolish daughter? She spoiled everyone's life. She herself is in silk. But she didn't think about her mother. Mummy, don't. I'm sorry, don't swear. I'll fix everything. Everything will be different. Her mother had almost reached her and stretched out her hands. Then Michael woke up. He saw Camila, who looked into the void and whispered in madness a plea for forgiveness. Camila, what are you doing? Camila finally saw that there was no one in the room but Michael. His shout made her eyes clearer, but the fear remained.
There's someone in the corridor.
Why did you drink wormwood last night? You can't have visions. Wormwood doesn't give you visions. Something's been spiked, that's what it is. And you can have the second jar. Camila flinched. Jennifer was talking to her. Cloudberries. Eat some cloudberries. Oh my God, it was Jennifer again. My head hurts. It's impossible. Let's go to Mum. She'll tell you what to do. Take the jar. Camila obediently got ready. She could still hear someone else's footsteps in the house. Shadows seemed to lurk in the corners. She fumbled, grabbing Michael by the arm. Has your mother let you go yet?
Just out of sleep, I think.
Mrs. Kimberly took the jar, sniffed and laughed. Well, darling, you'll be dreaming of things for a long time to come. Grebes for grebes, they should have called it. The neighbor laughed again, but sat her guest down. She fiddled with the herbs and poured some fragrant tea. Here, drink it. It'll make you feel better. You probably have a headache. Thank you. I hope it doesn't make me feel better.
If you don't want to drink it, get out of here.
Why are you being so strange, Mrs. Kimberly? You're always pushing me around. Now you're helping me. Camila, remember the basic truth. You can forgive anything, but you can't atone for the guilt of an innocent child. Camila to the house saw Michael, said that today with her babysitting will come in the evening. The woman entered the house anxiously, not noticing anything suspicious. Her head felt heavy, and she wanted to sleep. She fell asleep quickly, barely putting her head on the pillow. She woke up to her family's voice. Hello, daughter. Her mother was sitting on the edge of the sofa. Mum, hello, how I missed you. What a beauty you've made. I wish I'd done it before. It would have been so nice. Mum, I'm sorry, Camila cried, tried to get up but couldn't. She struggled on the sofa, opened her eyes, the cushion was wet. There was no one in the house, it was just a dream. But Mum, we'll meet for real. I'll change everything. My head was still heavy, dizzy, my temples ached. I went to the kitchen, took a jar of jam, twirled it around, tasted it by machine, struggled to do housework. After tidying up, she decided to cook something tasty, make some pies to treat Michael to in the evening. She had a secret sympathy for her neighbor. She felt at ease with him, as if he were her own. After an hour, she was surprised to note that her head was gone and her consciousness was clear. A burst of strength and appetite reminded her that she had quite recovered. Cloudberries helped. For after tea, Mrs. Kimberly had dreams. Camila was starting a new phase of her life, determined to find something to do so she wouldn't sit idle. She used to work under her husband in the prosecutor's office as a secretary. Together with Nicholas's father, they had made a fortune and become respected people in the city. But now Camila realized that no luxury could replace family. The longing for her son, the desire to see her granddaughter and meet her mother became the main value of her life. It was getting dark. Camila cooked some goodies and waited for Michael's arrival, and then, angry, decided to go to bed. There was a knock at the door, but instead of her neighbor, a girl came in and slipped her an envelope and disappeared. This made Camila completely angry. She wanted to throw the letter away, but she relocated herself, sat down and printed out the message. Many roads lead to redemption, but unfortunately not all of them are peaceful. Sounds like a threat. Came a man's voice over the top of her ear. Who's there? Camila shrieked in horror and jumped up sharply. Scaring you is my job. Michael laughed, genuinely laughing at his hostess. Did you do that on purpose? And I baked you pies, you will not get a single one. Get out of here. I'm an old woman. I have nerves, I have a weak heart. If I don't live to see my son and granddaughter, you'll be responsible for this sin. You know that, mark my word. You cursed me. You should close the door. What's the fashion? She came like a witch. I'll go to bed, mad woman. Wait, sit down, eat. Woof. What are you doing? You're giving me commands like a dog. I'm sorry, I was only joking. Bring me your pies. Okay, but don't sneak around again. Next time I'll give my soul to God for sure. Don't be pompous, you've got another 30 years on you. What kind of treatment is that? Don't you have any other words for me? There are, but you'll like them even less. Don't say anything. I can't imagine what's going on in your head. You, Michael said with a sudden change of tone, and then added with a smirk, you, my love, are a pain in the arse. Camilla Jones choked on her tea, coughed up tears, wanted to answer something, but instead sat silently, her eyes goggling. Have you lost your mind, you furry hedgehog? The suitor did not expect such a reaction. He wanted mutual recognition, warmth of relations, that she would lower her eyes modestly, take her hand and say that she needed him very much. Indignantly, he jumped up, ran outside, and Camilla slumped into her chair. She herself had not expected such a reaction from herself. She was considered a reserved lady. Why did she have the country ways of a silly girl? After cleaning up the kitchen and closing the doors, she lay down. She woke up early, remembered last night with shame, and then fulfilled the promise she had made to herself. Before lunch, she went round the village looking for work. Everywhere they offered only temporary help in the household. Then she resolutely went home and changed her clothes. Redemption, that's what was needed. That's what the letter said. First, she went to Mrs. Kimberly's house to help with the vegetable garden. Then she went round the neighbors to make life easier for the old people. She didn't take any money for her work, and she refused to buy groceries. It was getting dark by the time she got home. Her back was sore from unaccustomedness, but she felt happy. For the first time in many days, she felt proud. As she approached the porch, she heard a rustling behind the house, a dark figure, a vision. She decided to see what was there, but after walking a few steps, she suddenly fell into a hole, hit her head on something hard, and lost consciousness. When I woke up, it was unclear what time of day it was, but it was dark all around. She turned her head and tried to get up, bumped herself, shrieked, felt around. There were wooden walls everywhere, boards on top. She was trapped in some kind of box. A cold, sickening sense of dread filled her. The hopelessness of it scared her deathly. Help me. Help me. Help. Camilla screamed and thrashed hysterically. It seemed to her that an infinite amount of time had passed. Her body felt stiff, her head ached, but she took a full breath and calmed down. She remembered the words from the letter, not all roads to redemption are peaceful. It was too much, too much. You can't torture a person like that, you can't. Camilla screamed and cried as she climbed to the top. Then she noticed that the lid was sliding. She pressed her hands and head against it, opened it with effort, was blinded by daylight, squeezed her eyes shut, then stood up. Her heart hammered and nearly stopped with terror. She was standing in a grave, in a coffin. It was a cemetery. From the last strength on weakening legs, she began to get out of the grave. At that time, the drunken watchman came running to her screams. When he saw someone climbing out of the grave, he almost had a stroke, but he ran up and managed to push Camilla out of the grave. Ugh, damned zombie, sit with your ugly face, where your relatives put you. Despair seized the unhappy woman, but she guessed to talk calmly. Granddaddy and Granddaddy, be careful. She called out to the watchman. Oh, it's the evil one. Lord, forgive me. I've sinned. I repent. I swear I'll never drink again. Grandfather, I'm alive. I fell down. I was visiting my family, and here is an open grave. Grandfather, please help me, pitifully pleaded Camilla. A cunning zombie, pretending to be a human. He looked into the grave, saw Camilla there, in her black work clothes, with her tangled hair loose. Help me, you idiot, you stupid bloody fool. Get me out of here at once. She whispered in helplessness, as if hissing at her grandfather. Holy Mother of God, what a disgrace. The watchman ran away frightened, not stopping to cross himself. Well, and go, you heartless man, go yourself. On the third attempt, Camilla got out. The cemetery was deserted, beyond it a field, a path led somewhere, but where the village was, it was difficult to understand.
The roads to redemption are far from peaceful.
How did I even get here? How could anyone do this to a living person? I sat down by the roadside, braiding my hair, which seemed deliberately unraveled and tangled. In the ominous silence of the cemetery, thoughts of life and death came to mind. This is the end of everyone's life. How much in us is empty, unnecessary, contrived? The end of one in the grave, damp earth. As long as you're alive, you should not only think about yourself. I wasn't crying, it's just dumbness. There's a path ahead. Does it lead to a new life? I have to go through it. Maybe this is the road that's not peaceful. Mummy, tell me, are you playing games with me? How could you do such a thing? Camila knew the answer. She had forgotten the way to her mother. It was time to go back. That's where the soul would be born again. She mentally forgave for everything. This redemption was important. She would overcome any difficulties and beg for forgiveness. The path led to the road. Only no one passed by. In about 15 minutes, Camila was exhausted. She was thirsty and her legs ached. She sat down on the side of the road and decided to wait for a car. A tractor appeared, and by some fateful coincidence, Kevin was behind the wheel, and he agreed to give her a lift to the village for a small fee. Camila breathed a sigh of relief, then noticed a familiar rucksack at her feet, leaned over and twirled it, horrified to see the secret embroidery on the strap, which she herself had customized for her son, Nick Johnson. "Stop this right now. Tell me where you got that from." "I found this rucksack on the side of the road. It was a long time ago. I don't remember when." "Tell me the truth." Camila went after the driver, slapped him. Kevin didn't stand for it, got out and threw the woman out of the tractor and drove off. Camila Jones made her way to the village in tears. She was determined to find out for sure. There was a glimmer of hope of finding her son. His rucksack is here, so Nicholas has arrived. He and Jennifer are not far away. They're making fun of her. When she reached home, she locked herself in the dark and fell into a heavy sleep. Michael came to her more than once, but could not get through. Camila woke up for the first time late in the afternoon, heated water, washed herself properly, and ate with appetite. Life was coming back to her. The apathy of the last few days had subsided. She got dressed up and took her documents, deciding to go to the neighborhood policeman. "Hello, 5 years ago my son went to this small town but never returned." "Wait," said the officer on duty. "I'll call a neighborhood policeman to you, and you'll make a statement with him." The woman waited for an hour. Then she was invited into the office. "Hello, Richard Gray, the district police officer. What do you want to see us about?" Camila Jones gave a detailed account of the events of the last 5 years. She described yesterday's incident in detail. She was asked to write a statement, promising to sort out the rucksack. Called in the evening, told to report to the station, refused to search. Kevin Reed showed a brand new rucksack with no embroidery. The house was searched. Nothing was found. A clever bloke figured out what was going on, got rid of the stuff, burnt it in the backyard. Camila did not achieve anything. The trail was broken, but she did not take the statement. The policeman angrily escorted the woman out, stiffly telling her that Nicholas was missing. Camila did not give up. She decided to turn to Michael for help. She needed to nail this Kevin guy to the wall, but the neighbor refused to help. "Are you crazy going to an ex-prisoner with a war? Just take it easy. It'll work itself out. Don't you realize that's my son's rucksack? I haven't seen him in 5 years, and this Kevin Reed guy is obviously making trouble. If you don't help me, I'll go to him myself." "No, you can't stop, and anyway, where the hell were you yesterday? Helping out in the garden for free again?" "Yeah, I was helping out, digging in the ground." She didn't want to say anything so she wouldn't scare Michael. "Let's face it, I don't need it. It keeps my mind off my dark thoughts." They stood on the doorstep, arms around each other, as if they were young, with all the burdens off their shoulders. People who had passed the test, forgiven each other for the present and the past. Mrs. Kimberly was calm, but only told him to help with the household chores as before. The new message arrived 2 days after the cemetery. Camila was already expecting it, and opened it without excitement. It was a postcard with an invitation to visit the holiday home by the river. Michael took the news calmly. Mrs. Kimberly sighed mysteriously, smiled imperceptibly. They both knew the landlady of this inn. Camila had one last test ahead of her. Michael refused to go with her no matter how much she begged him. He remained adamant. Camila hastily packed, took the invitation card and set off on her journey. The journey was not long, about an hour. The good road changed to a road without tarmac, and it became more difficult to drive. Every now and then the car bounced. Finally, a holiday home appeared in the distance, occupying an impressive space. Several hunting lodges and a 2-story building were located along the river. At the gate, the guard let her through without question. Driving into the territory, she read the name. In bright red letters on the building was written Cloudberry. 5 years ago, Jennifer Jones had found herself on the street because of her mother-in-law's dastardly scheming. The biggest blow was her husband's betrayal. Did not believe, did not support, kicked out as a mean woman. She could not bear it. Her heart was broken. There was no point in living any further. Without a shadow of a doubt, she stepped on the road, but a man who was passing nearby, a second before the irreparable, pushed Jennifer away. She only hit her head, but still went to the hospital. The doctor told the unbelievable news: the girl was pregnant. Only this saved Jennifer from the monstrous pain on her heart. She wiped her tears and decided to live against fate. She did not want to return to her husband. She could not forgive the betrayal. There was only one way back to her homeland, to her native small town. When Jennifer returned, she tidied up the house and cried for 5 days after being locked up. It was worth it to get her life together for the sake of her child. After relocating herself, she drove into town and quit her job at the shop. Camila's mother, Nicholas's grandmother, the same Mrs. Cassandra, met Jennifer at the shop and told her to tell her the truth. They were not only neighbors. Jennifer often helped with the household. Nicholas's grandmother came to visit. The girl became a native for a lonely woman, but Camila did not know it and did not see beyond her nose. In the evening, the pregnant Jennifer could not resist and told Mrs. Cassandra at length what she had been through in the past year and a half. The neighbor wept, unable to believe the meanness of her own daughter. Then the old woman took Jennifer in to help her through this difficult time. The girl got a job in a bakery and managed to help her patroness as well. When Camila came in search of traces of Nicholas and Jennifer, the daughter-in-law was in the next room. She also bribed the people of her town to make her mother-in-law think Jennifer had not returned to the village. Not for a second did the daughter-in-law feel sorry for her mother-in-law, but the news about Nicholas disturbed her. She began her search. The first attempts to find her husband were in vain. 7 months later, Jennifer gave birth to a daughter and named her Caroline. One day, walking on the riverbank, the girl thought how good it is in a small town. From the big city you can rest. After all, it is a very good idea to build a house on the shore, so that in it the inhabitants of the big city could have a rest. This thought she shared with Mrs. Cassandra. To her great surprise, she brought the whole 2 million wrapped in a cloth. Wow, where did you get that kind of wealth? I've been saving, Camila's been throwing money at me like a dog and I can't spend it. She wouldn't show her face to me for 5 years. Only Nicholas used to come round and leave me some money too. I saved up. I wanted to give it to a good cause or a church. I don't need anything myself. Take it. I'm sorry to you. You've suffered because of my daughter. Thank you. It's not just for me. It's for you and a good cause. After consulting a lawyer from the city, Jennifer got a permit and bought a plot of land by the river. The first house came out small. At first, Jennifer didn't think it would be anything worthwhile. She advertised in the city. People showed up, buying places 2 months in advance. A year later, 2 two-story buildings were built, supplemented with hunting lodges. The demand did not fall, and the profit grew. For the summer, Jennifer and her grandmother moved into a cabin built especially for them. All the while, the girl continued her search. She knew that Nicholas never returned home. From work, he was expelled because of a long absence. Jennifer traveled all over the county in search of her husband. Once she remembered the God-forsaken farm, Nicholas, who lived under the name Norman, remembered the past in scraps. Once he had easily settled a dispute between men by reciting lines of law that popped up. After that, people began to go to him for minor matters, to secure their property by law, or to register land, to fill out documents. It became clear, not just a guest was sheltered. Over time, Nicholas cooled to his common-law wife. An unknown anxiety was troubling his soul. He went to the river all day fishing, wistfully recalled the same village, his grandmother. Pictures of the past life gradually returned to him. Catherine immediately realized that Norman began to avoid her. The stern girl packed her things and returned to her mother. Nicholas Jones has not thought to return that one. Only suffering he brought his indifference. There, in the depths of memories, woke up feeling for the mysterious girl with a basket of cloudberries. He saw her in a dream, walking along the road. Then everything was cut off by a black cloth. So he suffered for another 6 months, remembering the past in fragments. He found out where he was found, and the next day, without informing anyone of his plans, was going to go to his native small town. In the morning, he got up early, got on his motorbike, and drove away. It had been almost 2 years since he had crashed before reaching his destination. Now he knew for sure that this journey had to be completed. That same day, Jennifer arrived at the farm where Nicholas lived. She went round 5 yards before they dared to tell her the truth about the accident. Jennifer was taken to Nicholas's house, but no one was there. The villagers threw up their hands and invited her to visit. She could finally tell who they had sheltered, they in their village. Nicholas pulled onto the road, read the signs, looked around, then stopped his gaze on the cars that occasionally passed by. He remembered, instantly refreshed, the memory of that fateful day when a tractor had driven at him on this very spot. Jennifer, a sharp pain stabbed at his heart. How will you be without me? He guessed that all the misfortunes had befallen them, only because of his own mother. One planted packet of pills and a fictitious note had ruined an entire family's life. Nicholas took a long time to come to his senses, hesitant to continue on his way. He walked between the trees, horrified by the abyss in which he had lived for the last 2 years, as if he had come out of a coma. Finally, he decided to go to his grandmother to comfort her. It seemed to him that an eternity had passed. When he reached his grandmother's doorstep, he ran into the veranda. Towards him, hearing the motorcycle, ran out Mrs. Cassandra. Both were crying and laughing. "Nicholas, you're alive," I felt, "my darling. That you were coming back, that you were alive. Let me look at you. You've grown up. Grandma, you're still the same. Don't cry. It's all right. Everything will be different now. How could you torture us like that for 2 years? Didn't your heart tell you? Didn't you feel sorry for your family?" "I just remembered you today, Grandma. Where's Jennifer?" "She went to look for you. You don't know anything, Father." She gave me a sly grin and led me into the house. "Caroline, come and meet your father." Nicholas saw a little girl looking with clear blue eyes. "Daughter." He exhaled and burst into bitter tears again. Kicked out his pregnant wife. For 2 years she was alone without him. The girl shook her uncle's hand and ran off to play. She was brought up by her mother and grandmother. She was too young to understand the complexities of life. "Where's Jennifer?" "Jennifer went looking for you?" "She's been looking all the time. She went to the farm." Nicholas shuddered as he missed his wife. That fate was confusing them. He decided to wait here for her return and had a long talk with his grandmother. Mrs. Cassandra bitterly told him that not only Jennifer but also his other girls had been turned away from her son by his mother. Camila once even repented in a fit of despair about how she had separated her son from Jennifer, how she had written a letter to her son on his behalf, how she had wanted to make him infertile. Nicholas could hardly believe that his mother had arranged the meanness. A lump came to his throat. In vain he didn't believe his wife, defended his mother. Because of her he had almost lost his life, his wife and his daughter. "Grandma, you can't let it go." "I can't. I don't want to see or know her again." Jennifer returned late at night, approaching the house, saw Nicholas's motorbike, dazed, burst into tears and rushed into the house with all her might. Bursting in, she threw herself around Nicholas' neck because she knew her lover had not betrayed her. Caroline ran to her mother and started beating Nicholas with her palms, afraid that her uncle would hurt her mother. They decided to all live together, but moved into a holiday home, which needed owner supervision. Mrs. Cassandra stayed on, promising to move in with her grandson and great-granddaughter later. The holiday home prospered, growing. Nicholas's help proved invaluable. They correctly registered the property, expanded, wisely conducted business. Nicholas called his daughter Cloudberry and spent all his free time with her. The girl did not dote on her father, attached to him with all his heart. For 3 more years, Nicholas did not want to hear anything about his mother. Time has softened him a little, and he decided to forgive his mother. But only by changing would she be forgiven. Nicholas himself devised a plan of redemption. Jennifer and grandmother accepted the proposal to teach her mother a lesson, not immediately. It seemed too cruel a way to bring Camila to her senses. "Come on, Nicholas, Mom's been through enough. 5 years since she lost you. Jennifer, she didn't even spare our future children. Nicholas, I never drank her teas. It was impossible to drink that stuff. Sometimes she switched the decoction, sometimes she poured it out. It was disgusting. What did she use for wormwood? Let her drink the wormwood herself. It was like this." Nicholas had been living at the house of Mrs. Kimberly, a neighbor. When Camila came to the house, the son was in the back room, a few meters away from his mother. He was glad to have her around, alive and well, but changing her character was more important than meeting her. For the time being, Mrs. Cassandra had moved into Jones's house at the holiday base. Nicholas wrote a message, changing his handwriting beyond recognition. He wanted his mother herself to feel a little of what Jennifer had experienced. It didn't seem enough for him to just confuse her. He invented a whole epic of redemption, remorse, separation from his granddaughter, the bitterness of loneliness. The cloudberries and wormwood were also prepared by Mrs. Kimberly, and the wormwood was laced with sleeping pills and hallucinogenic grapes. It seemed unnecessary, superfluous, but Nicholas persuaded his neighbor, as it could do no harm. At the pharmacy, they took a remedy for poisoning, which they mixed into the cloudberries. Nicholas came in the night when his mother drank a decoction of wormwood, worried how she felt. But it turned out that the son only aggravated the situation, scaring the mother to death. The story of the repairs and help stunned Nicholas. It was beyond his plans, but it was a good sign. Camila changed beyond recognition, began dating Michael. The neighbor was against this punishment, but he could not change anyone's mind. He only supported Camila in her troubles. The hardest step for the son was the story of the cemetery, but once he himself cheated death, as if born again, he looked at everything with different eyes. He wanted to make his mother feel the same way. The hole was not deep, but he forgot to put the shovel away. Camila hit her head, but not badly. Nicholas gave her a shot with sleeping pills and took her to a pre-prepared hole in the cemetery. There was indeed a man to be buried there, so the grave was dug. He hastily chipped something that looked like a coffin, more like a box with a lid easily removable from the inside. He had even carefully placed a pillow. Later, Nicholas was horrified at what he had done, but remembering that Jennifer had lived in hell for a year and a half, and then almost lost a child, he calmed his conscience. He waited anxiously for his mother's return. He knew that the local people would pick her up on the road. The lust for life would take its toll. Camila returned in a deplorable state, and then went to the police station. But Richard Gray knew Nicholas's story, and even befriended him, sometimes using his legal knowledge. He rang Camila's son beforehand and asked what to do. That way Camila didn't find out ahead of time that Nicholas was alive. Perhaps the son's decision to leave his mother in the dark was too cruel. For 3 years he held a grudge. He couldn't forgive. Only Jennifer, P, and Grandma softened his heart. They sympathized with Camila with all their souls, several times wanted to tell her that Nicholas was alive, but did not dare to interfere. The long-awaited moment had come. Camila Jones arrived at their holiday home and entered the main building. There was no one in the lobby. An Indian tune was playing. She looked around, saw the television, and was taken aback. Pictures of her granddaughter, mother, daughter-in-law, and son were changing one after another. "Nicholas," she whispered quietly, tearfully. "I'm sorry, Mum." A familiar voice sounded behind her. Camila turned round, saw Nicholas, shrieked, and fell senseless. She had to call an ambulance. Later it got worse. They took her to the city clinic. The woman had suffered a stroke. Nicholas could not believe what was happening. Instead of a happy reunion and family reunion, he drove his mother to the hospital. Silenced, Mrs. Cassandra, without a word, packed up, left for her home. The magical transformation of the dwelling echoed painfully in her heart. Her daughter had lovingly furnished it. She had made a miracle with her own hands. The old mother sat on the new sofa, thinking that not so long ago Camila had slept here. "I forgive you, my daughter," she said tearfully. She lay down on the sofa and fell asleep and never woke up again. In the evening, Mrs. Cassandra was visited by Michael as usual, but it was too late. He broke the sad news to the Johnsons. 3 days later, the funeral took place. Half the town gathered to say goodbye. Nicholas and Jennifer cried uncontrollably. Cloudberry screamed loudly, unable to understand why her beloved grandmother had been buried in the ground. Camila was discharged a week later. Still recovering from the blow, she tried to speak, but nothing came out. She could hardly move, mumbled and cried. For the first time, the family lived at Mrs. Cassandra's house. Nicholas nursed his mother, gave her massages, made her do exercises, and in the evenings got on his motorbike and went somewhere. He couldn't forgive himself for the anger he harbored towards his mother. Whatever she was still his own. He himself is just as bad a person. He himself must go on a journey of redemption. His mother's illness, his grandmother's death, and the weight of guilt heaped on his shoulders. Michael came to Camila, took her in his arms, put her in the pram he had bought for her, and they walked together along the river. After 2 months, Camila began to speak and walk on her own. "Michael, I want to go home."
Where to?
"To the city." And your son, your granddaughter? Are you coming with me? How can I leave my mum? You'll visit her. We'll get her a helper. Michael was really attached to Camille. After some thought, he agreed. The next day, while Nicholas and Jennifer were at work, they left for the city. Nicholas was informed of the move by Mrs. Kimberly, shook her head sternly, and from then on stopped all communication with him. 10 years passed. The young, beautiful Cloudberry, who was now called Caroline, graduated from high school and entered teacher training college. Over time, Camila thawed out, recovered. In the city, she took rehabilitation courses at the best clinic. For the summer, she and Michael moved to the countryside, visiting Nicholas. Mrs. Kimberly lived in the city for 5 years next to her son. She passed away quietly, with God's blessing, buried next to Mrs. Cassandra. They were neighbors as well as they ever were. The family council decided that Caroline would now live in town like a queen. They entrusted her with the ancestral flat. Michael and Camila sold the house in the village, gathered their savings, and went traveling. There were too many painful memories here. The Johnsons Jr. sold Mrs. Cassandra's house, deciding to leave the small town. They bought a condo in Florida, hired a manager for their holiday home base, and moved in. They visited their daughter almost every month, until she graduated and got a job in their small town as a primary school teacher. Camila and Michael come to visit to see their granddaughter. They traveled all over the United States and then went to live by the sea. Over time, the holiday home passed to Caroline, who remains faithful to the land where she was born. Every summer she comes to the cemetery with a basket of cloudberries to visit her grandmother.
Buddy, just take a bite. Bobby urged, but Buddy's dog turned his face away from the chicken cutlet. He didn't want to eat. Buddy was seriously ill and couldn't get up anymore, and the boy suffered for it with all his soul. After all, he had no one more dear to him than a dog. For 2 years, Bobby met Buddy, when he once again ran away from the orphanage.
But he did not sit quietly in a cozy and warm place where Aunt Mary cooked delicious borscht and baked fragrant pies for tea. Craving for adventure greatly upset his favorite teacher, Polly Patricia. Only thanks to her wild and withdrawn 3-year-old kid, who was picked up at the train station, grew up a kind and open guy. "Where have you been?" 2 days, excitedly asked Polly Patricia, and seeing a small dog behind his back, added, "Who's that?"
"That's Buddy," Bobby muttered. "He's a stray, like me. Nobody wants him and me. I'm not kicking him out."
Bobby prepared to defend his friend and even to take any punishment he could, but that didn't happen. Polly Patricia smiled.
"How skinny is he? We should feed him. Take him into the yard. Give him what's left in Aunt Mary's kitchen. I'll have Jerry the janitor build a booth. I dibs on Uncle Jerry's help in cleaning up after the dog," she said. "Okay, all right. Thank you." "Buddy, you're not getting kicked out," exclaimed a happy Bobby. "Because we need you both," said the teacher, and hugged her naughty pup. So the dog stayed at the orphanage and soon became a favorite of the children. They took turns cleaning his box, washing bowls, and cleaning up piles. The superintendent, who was against the experiment, finally gave in and admitted that Polly Patricia was right. Pets make children more responsible and kinder, better than rules and lessons. And then Buddy got sick. They tried all the inexpensive remedies, but nothing worked. The dog was getting worse and worse. "Maybe he ate something bad," Jerry suggested. "Maybe somebody kicked him." People are all kinds of people. Seeing the tears on the child's face, the janitor added, "You better go to the dog doctor. His veterinary clinic is over there. They can help you with anything." Bobby ran as fast as he could in the direction Jerry had shown him. Indeed, across the street from the drugstore was a small building with a brightly colored Dr. Wolf sign. There were several people inside, with cats, dogs, even a monkey on their arms. "Can I just ask?" The boy addressed the stranger with a sheepdog with a trembling voice, and he nodded his head. In the office sat a young doctor with kind eyes. He was writing something down. "What are you worried about?" he asked. "My name is Bobby. I don't know where to start," said the boy. "My dog is sick. What do I do?" He's lying there whimpering and he won't eat or drink. Bobby's lips quivered. He could feel the tears coming, and the boy clenched his fist tightly to keep from crying. The doctor saw that. "My name is Daniel John," he introduced himself. "Then we'll know each other. Who's Buddy?" "He's my dog. Actually, he's an orphanage dog. We've been giving him all sorts of belly powders, but they don't work. I think he might die." "Oh no, really," Daniel John calmed him down. "Why don't you run down to the orphanage and get someone to bring him in? I'll examine the dog for free and do an ultrasound, x-rays, take some tests. I'll give him whatever meds I can afford at first, and then I hope you can handle it."
"Thanks, Buddy," the doctor cheered Bobby and stormed out of the office.
"Daniel John, not my name, not Buddy, not the doctor shouted after him, and he heard the queue erupt in laughter. By evening, the dog was examined. Daniel John found serious damage to his internal organs, giving him shots and prescribing a diet. The vet gave him medication and diet food. "Here, Bobby, look. It's all written here," he said. "Show this to your nurse. She can give Buddy his shots. But the dog needs surgery, and it's not going to be cheap." Daniel John named the amount. "Unfortunately, I can't take on that kind of expense," said Bobby. "My mom is very sick at home. I'm struggling to make ends meet. You know, you're going to have to find the funds yourself. You're a smart kid. I think you can handle it." When the orphanage found out how much money was needed for treatment, the teachers grabbed their heads. Of course, no one had that kind of money. Even with the combined modest salaries, teachers did not collect even half of the necessary amount. "Hey, better to put the animal to sleep and not torture it," Jerry said sullenly and looked back at Buddy. "No," said little Ollie, followed by the other girls. They could hear, for they were walking nearby. "We're not going to put anyone to sleep, but we're going to continue the treatment," said Polly Patricia sullenly. "Don't scare the children." "I'll find the money," Bobby said loudly. "I will." And he ran away from the orphanage again. "Give me a dash of gold, for Christ's sake. I need it or Buddy will die," Bobby sang in the crosswalk, playing a little harmonica. People threw money, and some stood and listened to the kid's pitiful song. "Get out of here," shouted a nimble bum and pushed Bobby's shoulder painfully. "Takes his money." "I'm not stealing." Bobby was confused and stood there like a stumbling block. Someone helped him collect the coins and bills, putting them in a pile. So he stood there with a small bag of money, just enough for a movie and ice cream.
"Boy, come here," a distinguished man in expensive clothes beckoned to Bobby.
He obediently approached, trusting the rich man's solid appearance. "Listen, what's your name?" "I'm Dinas Igor," the stranger introduced himself. "I'm Bobby." "Listen, Robert, do you want to make easy and just a lot of money?" he suddenly offered.
"I do, but it doesn't work that way," Bobby replied, remembering his conversation with Polly Patricia, in which she had told the boys that no one would give their money away for nothing, citing terrible examples.
"But I won't give you my organs, and I won't steal anything for you," he added. Denise Igor laughed. "Do I look like a bandit? I'd like to offer you a deal. Let's go to a cafe, and we'll talk there. This isn't the right place." While Bobby treated everyone to cakes and hot tea, Dennis Igor began his story.
"You see, brother, my wife is very ill at home.
Nobody can understand what's wrong with her. Severe weakness, dizziness, and general impotence. As they say, God did not give her children, though she wanted them very much. Your job would be to be around her constantly during the day, looking after her, helping her, reading books, just to talk about this and that. She refuses the help of a professional nurse. Will she accept you? I know she will. You could even sing her your own song. She'd love it. My wife's name is Barbara Valerie. She's kind. So what's it gonna be? What's it gonna be, Bobby? I'll give you the money as soon as you start working." Bobby was flattered that Dennis Igor was calling him by his full name. Besides, he really needed the money right away. When Bobby walked into Dennis and Barbara's house, he was amazed at the spacious room, especially the huge television. The house itself was a 3-story mansion with turrets and many rooms. Bobby wondered to himself why two people would live in such a huge house. After all, they had no children, not even a dog. Everywhere perfect interiors like on the pages of expensive glossy magazines, and not a single living soul. Boring. Only now did Bobby realize why Dennis Ager had asked him to be with his wife. They cautiously entered the small, bright bedroom where a young blonde woman lay on the bed, turned to face the curtained window. "Barb, I've brought you an interlocutor," Denise said quietly to Ager. "Bobby, go meet your hostess and get to your duties." Denise nudged Bobby, slipped an envelope of money into his jacket pocket, and walked out. Bobby sneaked around, afraid to wake his ward. He walked over to the patient's bedside. He wanted to get a good look at the one being paid so well. Barbara was awake. She turned her head and looked at his guest. Her face was pale and sad. Bobby's heart clenched at the sight of such a sight. He felt sorry for Barbara, who had everything but her health. "Who are you?" Slightly audible, she asked. "Why did he bring you here?" "I'm going to work here," said Bobby. "I'm going to help you in everything. And this uncle, your husband, will pay me a lot of money, and then I can cure my buddy." "Your what?" Barbara smiled faintly. "Buddy, my dog. He needs an operation of this cost," and Bobby spread his arms, the way fishermen do when they brag about the size of the fish they've caught. Barbara smiled. She definitely liked this direct and honest kid. "You can call me Aunt Barb if you don't want to, or if you don't feel comfortable sitting with me. Then I'll let you go." "Don't worry, I'll give you the money for the dog's treatment anyway. At least it'll help someone." "Not Aunt Barb," Bobby answered firmly. "I'll stay with you. Your husband has already given me some of the money. If you can, help me raise the rest. Also, it's kind of dark and stuffy in here. It's nice weather outside. You have to let some fresh air in." That's what they always told us at the orphanage, so Bobby opened the window and opened the window and opened the thick curtains, and a warm summer breeze blew into the room. Barbara smiled and propped herself up on her elbows. Bobby considered that a good sign. "Look, don't waste any time. Take the money to the vet. Have him do the surgery. Tell him Barbara Valerie will pay for everything. Have the bill sent to this address. They know me well in town," Barbara said. "Have you memorized what you need to say?" "Run and say buddy," Bobby, unbelieving his good fortune. Bobby nodded his head affirmatively and headed for the door. But suddenly he was back. He ran up to Barbara and hugged her tightly. A minute later he was gone. She got up and walked carefully to the window so that no one would see her. Bobby was nimbly flying at full speed. Barbara smiled. Today was an extra day. Thanks to this, the orphanage had brought her the joy of some boy. Uncle Jerry, the panting boy, called out, "Where's your wheelbarrow? I'm taking Buddy to surgery." He'd found the money, earned it himself. Daniel's surgery was a success. You want me to tell you it lasted a few hours? By evening, Buddy was wagging his tail happily, and the next morning, he was begging for food while he stayed in the vet's care. Bobby, on the other hand, went to work at Barbara's house. He clutched the invoice tightly in his hand. "Hello," said the sick woman. Her eyes glistened with curiosity. "Did your friend bring the bill?" "Good morning," Bobby smiled at Aunt Barbara. "Here are the receipts. Thank you so much for me and Buddy and all the boys, and this is for you from them." Barbara picked up a large folder. There were children's drawings and wishes for a speedy recovery. Tears came to her eyes. She hadn't expected such warmth from complete strangers. "Thank you, Bobby," she said quietly. "Don't cry, you'll get well too."
Bobby persuaded the sick man with all his wide, childish soul. "You'll see. Do you want me to sing you a song?"
Barbara wiped her tears with a napkin and nodded her head. "The song is cuckoo, the music is folk. The words are probably folk, too." "Bobby Rajah," Bobby began. "You cuckoo, cuckoo, one cuckoo and two cuckoos." When Barbara heard these simple words, her face changed. "Who sang that song to you?" "I know the person who composed it. It was a friend of mine. I used to live in a village not far from here when we were about 10 years old. We went swimming with her to the river. We were having so much fun that we forgot about safe water behavior. We swam too deep. Suddenly, I was swept up in the current and pulled to the bottom. I remember running out of air. I ran out of energy, and I was so terrified that I was going to die. What if someone's hand pulled me out of the pool by my hair? I took a breath. It was my friend Ellie. She saved me, but she drowned. Drowned how? Gasped Bobby, who hadn't expected the story to end so horribly. She was swept away by the current. I had no power to help her. They never found her. Barbara sighed, so the parents buried an empty coffin.
It wasn't your fault. Aunt Barbara. Bobby comforted her. It wasn't anyone's fault.
She looked at the boy. She felt ashamed that she had burdened him with her problems. Bobby had grown up without parents, and that was hard enough. Besides, she felt bad that she had to deceive the child by dragging him into this dirty game that Dennis was playing. In fact, Barbara was perfectly healthy, just pretending to be dying, and it wasn't the whim of a bored rich woman. Not at all. Barbara was panic-stricken by her husband, who in public was an exemplary and caring spouse, but in reality a real monster. To this day she recalls as a terrible dream a conversation between Dennis and her close friend, who turned out to be his mistress. Then Barbara's heart sank into her heels. Barbara listened to the whole dialogue, hiding behind the open door and holding a heavy tray. "What are you going to do?" hissed a disgruntled Nastia. When Barbara came out of the living room to fetch dessert, that's when she asked to join them for dinner. "I have a plan," Dina said quietly. "Wait a little while, my dear. You'll have it all. The house, the company and her diamonds. Just be patient. I've got a poison that no forensics can see. But it doesn't work fast, so you'll have to wait. When Vaska's not dead, I'll put it in the coffee. Then there will be no odor, and the poison will work faster." "You're a genius," Nastia smiled and pinched Dennis's cheek. Barbara looked at the tray, a jug of coffee she had made herself. Even knowing I wasn't here, her hands shook. But Barbara pretended she had just walked over and tried to calm down. She was disgusted to see this evil pair of traitors determined to steal her life, and Barbara was firmly determined to get her revenge. "I've got you to help me. Are you afraid, darling? I won't give you up that easily." "I'm going to expose you," Barbara said. "Here, help yourselves. It's the best quality coffee, and it's good for your health." She poured a cup for her husband and her traitorous friend. They looked at each other meaningfully. But Barbara already knew what the murderer was thinking, and that calmed her down a little. All that remained was to eat nothing and drink nothing from her husband's hands. "I've lived," Barbara thought. And now she had to lie to everyone that she was dying. Even her parents felt sorry for her mom. But it couldn't be helped. She couldn't be put in danger. Barbara's thoughts were interrupted by Bobby. Polly Patricia was singing a song. We all know it at the orphanage. We're very fond of Polly, that's what they call her amongst themselves. She's the only reason I'm not running away for good, because I know she'll worry. And she let me take Buddy, and she helped me with the treatment and the fundraising. You'd have loved her to death. That's the Polly that drowned. Then why didn't she come home? I don't know. That's why I'd like to find out from her. Will you introduce me? Let's go with you to your Polly's, Barbara suggested. What do you mean? Let's go to Polly's. Bobby was surprised. You can barely sit up. I've got to feed you, bring you a drink. Even if I called a cab, you wouldn't be able to get down, unless I asked Dennis Igor. No, Dennis, Barbara exclaimed. I'll tell you everything, but you must keep my secret. I swear, said Bobby, and his eyes sparkled with eagerness to know the secret. I can actually walk. I'm well, but I pretend to be sick. You see, it's to keep me from getting killed for money. And who wants to kill you? The boy was horrified. My husband and his mistress. Bitter, replied Barbara. Now you know everything too, and you must keep your mouth shut.
If they find out, you and I will be in danger, just so you know. If anything happens to me, it's Denis Semenov's fault. Remember that. And then you have to tell my story to someone, but only someone you trust.
I get it, Bobby said quietly. I'll help you. Aunt Barbara, and tomorrow I'll meet my teacher. Bobby felt like a spy caught behind enemy lines. It was more of a game to him than a confusing life situation. So when Denis walked past him, the boy squinted and wagged his finger at him. What's wrong with your assistant? He almost showed me his tongue, Denis said in surprise. looking at his sick wife. "That's how we play it," Barbara answered in a weak voice, worried that the boy might talk. "If anything, I'll be at the country club. You won't miss me, will you?" Dennis asked casually. "Sure, go," Barbara whispered, pretending to be exhausted, and finished her coffee. "I'm exhausted. Let the boy go back to his orphanage." Denise was satisfied with her answer, quickly changed into a tracksuit, took a large bag, waved goodbye, and left for his mistress. Barbara was well aware of this. Waiting until the convertible was around the corner, she gladly got out of bed and went to the kitchen to make herself and Bobby something tasty. Luckily, Denise had absolutely no knowledge of the household and rarely looked in the refrigerator, preferring to dine at expensive restaurants, grabbing a snack on the run and paying attention to his girlfriend with a chocolate dessert. The two conspirators went to the orphanage so as not to take any chances. Barbara hailed a cab. That way she could slip unnoticed from the gaze of the ubiquitous neighbors. To do this, she had to wear wide jeans and a hoodie instead of a sweatshirt. And at the same time, she wore a baseball cap up to her eyebrows. Now skinny Barbara looked a lot like a guy. When they drove up to the Heart shelter, Barbara's heart raced. She couldn't wait to see her favorite friend, the performer, to thank her for everything, to cry on her shoulder, to beg for forgiveness. Polly Patricia was in the auditorium, dusting the piano and the floor. Barbara called her name and ran up, spreading her arms for a hug. Polly turned around and looked surprised at the young woman running toward her. Barbara nodded cheerfully to Bobby, who quickly realized that something had gone wrong. Barbara suddenly stopped abruptly and stared at Polly. She didn't recognize her friend. She didn't look like Polly at all. And her eyes were bright green, not blue. "You're not Polly, I'm sorry," Barbara breathed out and cried, unable to understand. The teacher demanded an explanation from Bobby. Then she understood. "So that's not my Polly. Aunt Mary's neighbor described her to me. Said she wrote it herself and sang it with a friend once. So you're that friend?" "Yes, I want to see her," Barbara said.
So you missed her and suffered without my help. Why is your neighbor's name Mary?
"I don't know, but we can find out. I'll write down the address, and you can go and see her. But you must buy some milk on the way. Mary can't walk." "What's the matter?" Barbara was horrified. "She was hit by a car the other day. She barely survived. The doctors diagnosed a serious hip injury. She needs an operation that costs as much as an airplane wing." "Well, there's no way they can afford that kind of money." "Poor Mary," sighed Polly Patricia. "Every day I go in and help her with her chores. She's got no one." "Well, she'll have me now," said Barbara. "It'll be all right. Let me get the address." Several hours had passed since Barbara and Bobby left the house. Denise was due back. The cab, as luck would have it, was stuck in traffic. Barbara became nervous. She was afraid that the truth about her alleged illness would come out, and then she and Bobby would be in danger. There was no telling what a pinned-down hubby might do. After all, Barbara didn't know him at all. "Who are you really?" "Dennis Semenoff," she thought. In the meantime, he came home. Not finding his wife, he rejoiced, imagining her dead body being carried out of the room. But on entering the kitchen, he was cruelly disappointed. The table was littered with various delicacies, as if the place had been overrun with this diner. 2 cups had long since gone cold, indicating that the hostess and her cunning assistant had left the house quite some time ago. But that wasn't what pissed Dennis off. More than anything else, it turned out Barbara wasn't drinking coffee from the jar he poured the poison from, but from another, identical one that she'd probably stashed somewhere. So that old hag must have gotten wind that we were trying to kill her from somewhere and knew all about it, and she pretended to be half dead. She's a bastard. And the kid seems to know it. Looking at me so slyly and defiantly, the revelation startled Dennis. What if his wife went straight to the police? He began to think frantically about what to do in that case. It was dangerous for him to leave things as they were.
5 minutes later, the front door opened. Barbara and Bobby began to make their way to the second floor, where she was supposed to lie on the bed and make a dying face, but they didn't succeed. When the conspirators turned on the light in the room, they both shrieked. In a rocking chair beside the empty bed sat Dennis and glared angrily at the entrance. "Well, Barbara, this is the end of your game," his husband hissed, narrowing his eyes like a snake. "And what did you mean to prove by that? That your husband is an idiot? Or did you want to show you were smarter than everyone else? Make fun of me?"
"You know what? Don't yell in front of the baby," Barbara said dryly. It suddenly helped her to curb her fear by being angry with her husband, so it didn't matter anymore. "You wanted to kill me so you could steal the firm and marry Nancy. Well, that's a lie and your speculation." Dennis started to deny it. "You can't prove anything." "I will," Barbara said firmly, looking straight into her husband's eyes. "How do you know I don't have proof?" Barbara was bluffing, of course. But Dennis didn't know that, so he lost his temper. "Yeah, I'm sick of you. You care about one job and I don't. You didn't even have children with me. You've never had time for anything. But Nancy promised at least 2, a boy and a girl, and she takes care of me. Your prenup was clever. In case of infidelity, everything goes to the other half, and I don't want to be left with nothing. You left me no choice. Veriara, the only thing left was to get rid of you quietly, poison you, wait for you to die. And I guess you found out all about the poison in the coffee. But so blame yourself." Dennis Eager stood up and stalked toward her with a menacing look. All Barbara Valerie could do was yell, "Bobby, run, get the hell out of here, you puppy. I ain't paying you nothing," Dennis Eager yelled. Bobby turned on the recorder on his cell phone that Barbara Valerie had given him, slipped it into his pocket, and walked quickly to the door as the woman had instructed. Behind him there was swearing and china cups banging against the floor. Bobby stepped away from the house and called the police. When the front desk heard exactly where the unknown kid was calling for an outfit, they not only didn't believe him, but threatened to penalize him for disorderly conduct if it happened again. Dennis Semenoff's reputation as a decent businessman had never once failed him. Bobby was upset that Barbara's deception had been exposed and now she was in danger. But on the other hand, he was glad that she would finally find her missing friend. And he didn't need any more money from Dennis, because Jack the cat was almost healthy thanks to Barbara and Daniel John, and that warmed the soul of a child who was more worried about others than himself. Visits to cats and veterinary clinics. Bobby went to the orphanage where Polly Patricia was waiting for him. "So, did you go to Mary's?" "How did it go?" "No, we didn't make it." Bobby sighed. "Aunt Barbara and her husband had a fight because she didn't die like he wanted, and he chased me away." "How is that possible?" "I've heard that Dennis Semenoff is a decent man, so please don't make things up." Polly Patricia was perplexed. "Okay, don't worry about it. You'll go and see her tomorrow and check on her. How are you doing? Go have dinner. Aunt Mary made waffles with condensed milk today." Bobby woke up early the next morning, anxious to see Barbara and make sure she was all right. The dining room was still empty, but the tables were already set. After a quick breakfast, Bobby ran to Barbara's house. It was only a couple of blocks away. When he got to the gate, he was surprised to find it ajar. As he stepped through the massive doors, he found that the patio was open as well. "What kind of open house is this?" Bobby said aloud. "Hey, is anybody home?" Aunt Barbara, Dennis Eager, but no one answered. After running through the house from bottom to top, Bobby waddled back inside. Some unexplainable feeling was pressing on his chest, rumbling inside him as if he was short of air. The children from the orphanage were already playing on the playground and having fun, but Bobby didn't care about them. He retired to the break room and turned on the TV machine. And now for the breaking city news announcer tonight. Barbara Semenova, a well-known businesswoman and the main philanthropist of our city, committed suicide. She jumped off a bridge into the river and drowned. The body is still looking for rescuers, but except for her clothes, have not yet found anything. The inconsolable husband reported that Barbara was fighting an incurable disease, but despairing went to extreme measures. The funeral will be held on Friday. Now for some other news. No, that's not true. She didn't jump off the bridge. He killed her. Bobby screamed out of shock. Grief choked his heart. "What's the matter with you, kid?" Polly Patricia came running into the room. "Why did you pass out?" "Did you scare me?" "Did Barbara's husband kill her?" Bobby repeated. "He wanted to poison her, and now he's killed her altogether." "Murderer? What on earth are you talking about?" "Calm down," complained the tutor. "You're wrong. It is not easy to kill a man. What kind of animal would you have to be to raise a hand against a woman? And Denis Semenov is a decent man. You're just very upset. Bobby realized he was being disbelieved again. That was hard to take. There's no use calling the police. They might send him to the juvenile hall. Who would listen to him? And then Daniel came to mind, the animal doctor. What if we told him? Daniel, John, help. Bobby came running into the vet's office, out of breath. Trust me, please. And he told his story straight to the point, without leaving out a single detail, and Daniel seemed to believe him. So show me where Barbara lives, 'cause I'm not from around here. I don't know my way around town yet. When they reached the house, the door to the terrace was already closed. Bobby ran around, listening to every rustle behind the wall. Suddenly he heard a low thud. It sounded like someone tap dancing somewhere underground. Daniel, John, look, what's that? Bobby called out. It's Morse code. Someone's asking for help. There are people in the house. All right, Bobby, stand back, Daniel commanded. With a hard kick, he kicked open the door to the terrace. They walked toward the sound, which was getting stronger. The door to the basement was padlocked and propped up with a board for good measure, but Daniel made it through. When he opened the door, dampness and darkness enveloped them. The light bulb was out, so he had to turn on the flashlight on his phone. Someone was mooing in the darkness and kept pounding hard on the pipe with their heels. It was Barbara. Her hands and feet were bound tightly and her mouth was covered with a gag.
Aunt Barbara, Bobby rushed to her and hugged her. Are you alive? I was so afraid you were really dead. They said you drowned.
Daniel untied the captive and brought her out into the light. Hello, I'm a friend of Bobby's, he said, and was embarrassed. I'm sorry, Barbara. I kicked the door in here. I'll make it up to you later.
Hello, Barbara stared into the blue eyes of her savior and couldn't find anything else to say.
Hey, Bobby reminded himself, hugging them both. Let's get out of here. What if your crazy husband comes in with a gun? He won't. He's probably at the airport by now, Barbara said tiredly. He left me to starve to death, and he withdrew all our money and is trying to escape abroad. He's not going to make it, Daniel grinned. I'll call my friend the investigator and tell him everything.
I remember, Bobby exclaimed, when Denis Ego scolded me and Aunt Barbara. I recorded his conversation and he confessed everything.
Oh, but you're a detective, Daniel laughed. Good for you. You didn't hesitate. That'll help. While Daniel dealt with the capture of Barbara's devious husband, she decided to thank her saviors with dinner. Besides, she needed to calm down. A whole day without food or water was taking its toll. So when Daniel returned, they were treated to a sumptuous meal. Daniel, John, and Barbara Valerie hit it off right away. That pleased Bobby, who liked the vet. If a stranger walked into their dining room at that moment, he would have thought they were a friendly family having dinner and discussing how their day was going. Daniel was telling some funny story from his practice. Suddenly, Bobby blurted out, I wish you two were married. There was an awkward silence, and he realized he'd said too much. But Daniel mentally thanked him. He'd liked the sweet and fragile Barbara at first sight. The silence was interrupted by a phone call. Daniel, they caught your fugitive, the investigator reported. He got him right off the plane, the bastard. Denny's everything. We need a confrontation. Come tomorrow. Semyonova and the kid in the ward have been stolen. Now Barbara could breathe easy. Her life didn't seem to be in any danger, but she couldn't sleep at night. She dreamed of an enraged Denis with an axe, then little Polly's little girl being carried away by the river. And in the morning she went to the very same address to meet her childhood friend. The door was opened by a young woman in a wheelchair. Hello, what did you want? She asked idly, looking somewhere past Barbara. Polly, it's me, Barbara the visitor said quietly. You don't remember me? The woman shuddered and turned pale. It had been a long time since she had been called by her real name.
She gazed into Barbara's face. Yes, I recognize you. You were a childhood friend of mine, Barbara whispered softly. Polly, have you come? She rushed to Polly's lap and hugged and heaved her. Both sobbed for the joy of meeting her and for the grief they had both suffered.
After they had calmed down, the women sat straight in the hallway holding hands for a long time. Then Barbara helped Polly into a chair and sat down beside her. Tell me everything," she begged her friend. When I was swept away by the current, I tried desperately to survive, tried to get out of the current somehow. And then my strength ran out and I lost consciousness. I only remember being pulled out of the water by strong male hands. It was a gypsy named Peter. His tabor was not far from the shore. Peter was fishing and saw me drowning. That's how I ended up living with the gypsies. I must have hit my head hard because I couldn't remember anything about myself. They gave me the name Mary, and that's how I became Mary Gypsy. I didn't go to school, wandered around with the gypsy kids, begging for money from passers-by. And you know, I like that kind of life. Once, when I was standing at a crosswalk, a woman came up to me. She was surprised to see a blonde girl together with a Roma, and she called the police. I was taken to an orphanage, leaving that name behind, a name I never remembered. My past came to me in a dream. 10 years later, I remembered everything. My parents, you and my childhood. I was studying at the institute at the time. I rushed to my native village, but no one was waiting for me there. My dad and mom had died. Strangers had been living in the apartment for a long time. So she remained alone with her grief and this memory, which she no longer needed. "Why didn't you find me?" Barbara asked excitedly. "I would have been glad to know that you were alive and I would have helped you." "I looked," replied Polly, grinning bitterly, "but you had no one at home. The neighbor threw me out, said you'd gone to town."
Where did she say you'd gone to? She didn't tell the truth, Barbara said, horrified. I was the one who lived in the city, but my parents stayed in the village. I see. That neighbor always disliked my mother and was jealous of her, but it doesn't matter. Hey, what do the doctors say?
They said there's a slim chance. It's been too long since that rich guy Dennis Semenoff made a pass at me and threatened to blame me if I told anyone. He gave me money for the cheapest medicine and drove off.
Barbara turned pale.
And this Semenoff is now called Dennis. Yes, that's right, Polly answered. A tall brunette. And how do you know him? He's my husband, said Barbara. You know, he wanted to kill me. My lawyers already started divorce proceedings against him. By the way, Dennis is in jail. I'm on my way to the coroner's office right now, and I'll take you with me. You'll tell him everything. He should be punished on all counts. In fact, from now on, you're going to live with me until you get better. Then we'll see.
Do you have enough room for me? I'm in a wheelchair, said Polly, worried. It'll be all right, Barbara smiled. Dennis was frightened when he saw both of his victims in front of him. Polly was shaking with fear too, but Barbara took her hand and squeezed it tightly, supporting her friend, and Polly told the police everything due to the newly discovered circumstances. Dennis had another criminal case thrown at him, which meant that he would not be free for a long time.
Barbara and Polly were released. When Polly saw the house she was to live in, she was almost speechless. It was a luxurious mansion in a verdant garden, as if it had come from an artist's painting. From the excess of feelings, the guest cried. Oh, my dear friend, Barbara soothed her. Now you are in this house too. You will soon walk on this lawn with your own feet. Barbara kept her word. Polly was operated on a week later. Her friend insisted that Polly be rehabilitated in the mansion, not in a hospital bed. Barbara hired the best rehabilitator and nurse for this purpose. A few months later, Polly was gingerly taking her first steps. By her side were Barbara and Bobby Buddy, who loved Polly with all his heart and wanted to lick her nose every time. It was a great help in her recovery. You look sad, Barbara said. Look, you're doing well, and life's getting better. What's wrong? You know, I didn't tell you everything, Polly confessed to her friend. I didn't want to dump all my problems on you. I look at Bobby and I think of my daughter, Jennifer. What? Barbara was surprised. You have a daughter? Yes, but she was taken from me by my husband and my mother-in-law, Laura Pauline. That woman immediately disliked me because I was poor as a church mouse. She wanted the best for her son, and he chose me. Then Jenny was born and George went off on a bender. They took the baby away from me in the divorce, said mean things about me in court, scared my daughter. Now they won't even let us see each other. What a nightmare. But we're not going to let it go, Barbara exclaimed, so I'm calling my lawyer. Let's get our daughter back. So Barbara decided to visit her friend's neglectful relatives, but for that she needed Daniel. Their relationship was already in full swing, and with him to go, George was not afraid at all. She was protected by her lover when Barbara's expensive foreign car driven by Daniel pulled up to Polly's ex-husband's house. Laura Pauline spotted them through the window at once, but assumed the stern look of a businesswoman. Barbara knocked decisively. She knew how to talk to people like that. Daniel was already standing behind her, posing as a bodyguard. The door was opened by her mother, with George peering timidly behind her. "Is that who's running things around here?" Barbara thought. She said aloud, "Hello, is this the Konyukova residence? I'm looking for George Andreevich." "Yes," here the landlady replied warily. "What did you want from him?" "I'll only talk to him." "And who are you, I beg your pardon?" Barbara said. "I'm Polly Konyukova's representative." "Hello," said a middle-aged man, coming out of the back of the house. "What does she want?" "Don't you understand?" Barbara was surprised. "You deprived her of her parental rights and the opportunity to raise her own daughter. When my client was in a defenseless position, or rather lying in the hospital after the accident, I am authorized to withdraw the court decision, as well as to file a counterclaim, thanks to which you will not only give the child, but also pay a large sum of money for moral suffering caused to her. And I can also bring the case to criminal punishment. As they say, if there's a man, there's an article. So what are we going to talk about here on the doorstep?" "Mom," the cowardly son called out.
And immediately Laura Pauline, as if she were a dear guest, began to call Barbara and Daniel into the house. A crowd of onlookers had already gathered around them.
"Come in, make yourselves comfortable. You're the hostess here. I'll organize some tea. We don't mind making a deal. Why start a criminal case right away? My son is a good man, he hasn't broken any laws." "We'll find out," Barbara said dryly. "And if George doesn't mind, he can write it here."
Barbara handed him the agreement, which stated that Jennifer would be taken into her mother's custody and that George would drop his lawsuit for termination of his wife's parental rights. A terrified George signed it.
"Where's the baby?" Barbara asked. Laura Pauline brought in a skinny, blonde-haired girl who looked exactly like Polly when she was a baby. "Do you want to go to Mommy's?" Barbara asked Jennifer. "Yes, I do. I miss her so much," Jennifer shouted and rushed to Barbara, seeking protection from the strange woman. "And they're hurting me." "What do you mean they're hurting you?" Barbara exclaimed. "Daniel, call the police." The police arrived and recorded the beatings in the child's testimony. Barbara and Daniel were witnesses. George's parental rights had been terminated. Now he had a taste of justice. His mother only cursed her hated daughter-in-law. Mommy Jennifer ran up to Polly as she was doing calisthenics with her trainer. Polly couldn't believe her eyes. She jumped up, but staggered. Daniel held her up. Everyone cried. The picture of the reunion of inseparable mother and child left no one indifferent. Buddy lay beside Polly and touched her with his paw. Bobby stood at a distance and watched enviously as the strange girl found her mother. Barbara came up to him and whispered softly, "Do you want to be my son?" Bobby looked up at her with eyes full of tears. "I'd love to have a mom like you." "Well, then, let's hug," Barbara suggested to Valerie. "I love you so much." And in the evening they decided to celebrate the arrival of Jennifer to their extended family and the acquisition of Bobby and Mom. Daniel John tried the hardest. When everyone was seated at the table on the terrace, he turned to Barbara, Valerie, and said, "My friends, I ask you to be witnesses of my happiness. Barbara, Valerie, you will be my wife." And Daniel John handed her the ring. Barbara Valerie was not ready for such an event, but happily said yes, and Bobby clapped his hands with happiness. "Congratulations," Jennifer told him. "Now you have both a daddy and a mommy." After dinner, the children went to play in the clearing, and the adults sat at the table and talked for a long time, the more so because there were a lot of common topics. Meanwhile, quick Bobby and quiet Jennifer quickly found a common language, and the boy decided to show the new girl all his secret places where he liked to hide. One of them was an old abandoned house not far from Barbara Valerie's mansion. It was there that he took his curious girlfriend. It looks like a bandit's den, he boasted. Look, there are even old boats here. We could go fishing. Oh, what's the stove like? Jennifer marveled. Your fairy tales.
I'll bring the dolls in here and make a house for them, she said. Bobby wanted to reply that it wasn't a dollhouse, but a very real pirate fort, but he didn't have time. The children heard a thud, as if something heavy had fallen, and smelled the acrid odor of smoke. It was the house rebuildings burning. We've got to get away, shouted Bobby, but there's somebody out there. I heard a strange sound, insisted Jennifer. What if there's a dog in there that can't get out?
Bobby was frightened that it might have been arson and rushed into the vegetable garden, which was already taking fire. But it wasn't the dog. Jennifer, help, shouted the girl. Jennifer came running to the call and was stunned with shock. Before her lay a puny little grandfather whom Bobby was endeavoring to drag by the legs. Grab his arms. Let's carry him, Bobby commanded, and the room was already filling with smoke. The fire was spreading fast. The boys were coughing. It was difficult to get the though small but heavy grandfather out. Where's the exit? Jennifer shouted. I don't know, answered Bobby. Pull. Come on. Suddenly the boys were pulled outside by Daniel John's strong arms. Wait here. And don't go in the house, he said menacingly, and rushed inside. The children dared not disobey him and sat obediently at a safe distance. In a minute, Daniel John carried the haggard stranger out in his arms. The clothes and face of both were covered in soot. Daniel John brought the tramp to his senses. Grandpa opened his eyes and looked at his rescuer in surprise. Where? Who am I? He was clearly ill. Barbara Valerie and Polly Patricia were already running toward the cabin and had called the fire department. And soon, as Grandpa was being taken to the hospital, he suddenly looked at Polly Patricia and said, Daughter, won't you leave me? Polly Patricia cried with surprise. She had not heard herself called that for a long time, and she went with her grandfather in full determination to take him to her. She could not leave the unfortunate man to his fate, as had once happened to her. The doctors did their best to restore the patient's memory, and the unfortunate grandfather slowly began to remember everything. Now he knew where he came from, and that his name was Michael Arcady. He had Polly Patricia by his side at all times. Michael Arcady said to Polly Patricia, You should go home. I'm not comfortable. What are you? Uncle Michael, I'm not leaving you. Let's go home together. You don't have to suffer alone. Barbara Valerie said, We'll all live together. You have a family now, Polly reassured him. At the word family, Michael Arcady's face changed. But I have a son who has forgotten the common people. He's gotten too high and arrogant. That kind of thing, he worried. And so how did you end up in an abandoned house? Polly Patricia asked. I wanted to see my son with one eye. But on the way I was robbed by some subhumans, knocked on the head, and had all my money taken. I don't remember how I got to that house and what happened to the fire. If it wasn't for the guys, we wouldn't be talking right now. They're going to help find my son, Uncle Michael replied. Don't worry, Uncle Michael. Everything will be fine, Daniel promised John. Barbara Valerie and Daniel John and the boys were getting the room ready for the new tenant. Barbara was pleased to notice that her family was growing quickly. A week later, Michael's son Michael Arcady showed up at the hospital. A young man in an expensive suit walked into the room with 2 security guards. He looked worried. Father, how could it be? He exclaimed. I'm sorry, Father. I was a fool. Polly Patricia called and told me you almost died. Michael Arcady, with trembling arms, put his arms around his son and wept. Found me, son. Polly left the room to let them talk privately. She stood at the open window and enjoyed the fresh breeze. Suddenly someone touched her shoulder. It was Maxim. Thank you for taking care of my father. Not everyone could do that. Especially me, I was being selfish. What can I do in gratitude? You don't need to do anything, Polly smiled. Just be a good son. I've grown attached to Uncle Michael. Don't deprive me of his companionship. He wants to live with us. But if you object, tell him. Let him live where he's comfortable, Maxim agreed. I hope he'll want to move in with me later, but I don't seem to have as much fun as you do. My father told me how friendly you are. I envy you. You should come visit us. Uncle Michael will be glad. Polly understood Maxim and was grateful to him for it. They did not notice how happy Michael's grandfather was watching them and asked his son to walk Polly home, promising that nothing would happen to her.
Go and get some rest. There's no use fiddling with an old man. I'm still in my right mind, Michael Arcady said, as he walked his favorite.
Uncle Michael hoped that the spark in his son's eyes at the sight of sweet Polly would grow into something more and his child would find marital happiness, and so it did. All the while Michael Arcady was recovering in the hospital, Maxim was living at Barbara Valerie's house.
Having sent his guards home to another city, where he came from, Max temporarily settled in the mansion. A favor, the house had many rooms and could accommodate many guests. Now the house was filled with voices and noise in the kitchen. Everyone was gathering in the dining room for breakfast. It seemed that the whole family lived in the house, which delighted the hostess.
At first Max was surprised by the abundance of friendliness and openness of new acquaintances, but then quickly joined the family and was no longer bored. He enjoyed the antics of the children and even the barking of Buddy, the dog who greeted him after work. Max had decided to move his office closer to Barbara's house, where his father seemed to have shed the extra years and become more active. Michael Arcady's eyes glistened with joy, and the children kept Grandpa busy. "Grandpa, come to the river with us," Bobby begged. "You promised you'd teach me how to fish, didn't you?" Michael Arcady had long dreamed of grandchildren. His son Max was so busy that he didn't even have a family. However, everyone noticed that between Max and Polly began a romantic relationship. This was realized even by the children, who shouted to them, "The bride and groom are coming," and kicked out poor Polly in the paint. You can't fool a child's mind. Max announced to everyone that he intended to marry Polly since Daniel and Barbara had also decided to legalize their relationship. It was decided at a big family council to have a double wedding. "Here's the joy," shrieks from Bobby and Jennifer and loud cheers from the two happy couples. Michael Arcady gave the grand speech. Then all evening long, music blasted from Barbara's garden, caressing the ears. Neighbors would drop in to see what was so interesting going on in a house that had previously been closed. But when they learned the reason, they heartily congratulated the young, sincerely rejoicing at the pleasant changes. It turned out that none of them loved Dennis. A month later, a big wedding, to which were invited all the neighbors, friends, and colleagues. There was a huge marquee in the garden of Barbara's house. Two beautiful brides and their groomsmen adorned the presidium of one large table, which was bursting with treats. Beside them sat parents and children, congratulating the young ones and giving their blessing. Only Polly had no father and mother. There were tears in her eyes. Michael Arcady sat down next to her and hugged his daughter-in-law. "Daughter, don't cry, you have us. You're the closest thing I have to family, honey, and I won't let anyone hurt you," he said. "Thank you," said Polly, resting her head on his shoulder. She was happy, for she had a family around her, a daughter, a loving husband, and a father who would do anything for her. From behind her, someone's hand fell gently on her shoulder. It was Barbara, who was like a sister to her.